Welcome. Tonight on NightSleepWhisper, we are embarking on a very special journey to calm your mind and carry you into deep peace. A long and mysterious story of 50 chapters awaits us in the misty streets of Oakhaven. Now, find your most comfortable position, gently close your eyes, and take a deep breath. Thomas the watchman has lit his lantern. Our journey begins. The year was 1345. The winter was very cold in the town of Oakhaven. Large stone walls surrounded the town. At night, the gates were closed and locked. Nobody could enter, and nobody could leave. The streets were narrow and dark. The only light came from small candles in the windows of the houses. Thomas was the night watchman. He was a tall man with grey hair and a kind face. He wore a heavy wool coat and thick leather boots. In his right hand, he carried a long wooden spear. In his left hand, he held a metal lantern. The yellow light of the lantern danced on the snow. Thomas walked slowly. He knew every stone in the street. He knew every door and every window. The town was silent. Most people were asleep in their warm beds. Thomas liked the silence. It was his job to keep the town safe. He looked for fires. He looked for thieves. He looked for anything that was not right. Tonight, the wind was biting and cold. Thomas pulled his coat tighter around his body. He could see his breath in the air. "It is a quiet night," Thomas said to himself. His voice was low. He liked to talk to himself because the nights were very long. He walked toward the center of the town. The great church stood there. It was a massive building made of grey stone. It had a tall tower that reached toward the dark sky. The church was the pride of Oakhaven. Inside, it held many beautiful things. The most famous item was the golden cross. It was old and very valuable. Thomas reached the heavy wooden doors of the church. This was always the most important part of his walk. He checked the iron lock every night. But tonight, something was different. Thomas stopped walking. He held his lantern higher. The large iron lock was not closed. It was hanging from the door. Thomas felt a sudden chill that was not from the wind. He put his hand on the door. It was heavy and cold. He pushed it gently. The door moved slowly. It made a long, low sound against the stone floor. Usually, the priest locked this door at sunset. Why was it open now? Thomas stepped inside the church. The air inside was even colder than the air outside. It smelled of old wood and burnt wax. The church was very dark. The shadows were long and moved when Thomas moved his lantern. He walked toward the main altar. His boots made a steady sound on the floor. He looked at the table where the golden cross always sat. His heart began to beat faster. The table was empty. The golden cross was gone. Thomas stood in front of the empty altar. His hands shook. The golden cross was the most important treasure in Oakhaven. Without it, the people of the town would be very sad and afraid. He turned around and walked back to the heavy front door. He needed to see how the thief got inside the church. He knelt on the cold stone floor. He held his lantern close to the iron lock. The metal was not just open. It was broken. Someone had used a heavy tool to force it. There were deep scratches on the dark wood of the door. Thomas touched the scratches with his fingers. The wood felt rough. This had happened very recently. As he looked at the floor, he saw something small. It was a tiny piece of fabric caught on a splinter of wood. He picked it up carefully. It was dark blue silk. This was very strange. Silk was an expensive material. Only the rich people in Oakhaven wore silk. The blacksmith, the baker, and the farmers wore rough wool. Thomas put the blue cloth in his pocket. Who was here? He whispered. The church was very quiet. He heard the sound of the wind hitting the stone walls outside. Then, he heard a different sound from inside the building. It was a soft dragging sound coming from the back of the church. Thomas stood up. He held his spear tightly in his right hand. He walked toward the small hallway that led to the priest's private room. "Father John," he called out. His voice echoed against the high ceiling. There was no answer. He walked past the long rows of wooden benches. His lantern light showed the long shadows of the tall stone pillars. He reached the entrance of the hallway. The air here was heavy and smelled of iron. He saw a dark shape on the floor. It was a man. The man was lying near the wall, perfectly still. Thomas ran to him. He put his lantern on the floor and knelt down. It was Father John. The priest's eyes were closed, and his face was very pale. Thomas touched the priest's arm. It was cold. He looked for a wound and saw a small, dark mark on the priest's neck. Father John was breathing, but he was not moving. He was unconscious. Thomas felt a cold fear in his heart. The thief was not just a thief. They were dangerous. He looked around the dark hallway. The person who took the cross might still be hiding in the shadows. Thomas stood up and looked into the darkness. He was alone with a broken lock, a missing cross, and a hurt man. He had to find help, but he also had to find the person in the blue silk coat. Thomas stared at Father John. The priest lay very still on the cold stone. Thomas felt a pulse in the priest's neck. It was slow and weak, but it was there. He was relieved that the priest was alive, but he was also very worried. Father John was an old man, and the cold floor was not good for him. "I must move him," Thomas thought. But then he stopped. If he moved the priest, he might change something. He looked at the hallway more closely. The dragging sound he heard earlier had left a trail in the light dust on the floor. It led from the altar to this spot. Thomas followed the trail with his lantern. He noticed something else near Father John's hand. It was a small, heavy object. He picked it up. It was a silver button. The button had a picture of a lion on it. Thomas knew that symbol. It was the mark of the town's highest officials. Suddenly, a loud noise came from the far end of the hall. It was the sound of a heavy door closing. Thomas jumped. He grabbed his spear and ran toward the sound. The hallway ended at a small wooden door that led to the garden behind the church. Thomas pushed the door open. The cold night air hit his face. The garden was full of bushes and stone statues of saints. The moon was behind a cloud, so it was very dark. He held his lantern high, but the light did not go far. "Stop!" Thomas shouted. "Who is there?" He heard the sound of feet running on the frozen grass. The sound was moving toward the back wall of the garden. Thomas ran as fast as he could. His heavy boots made a lot of noise. He reached the back wall, but there was no one there. The wall was too high to climb quickly. However, there was a small wooden gate in the corner. It was swinging open. Thomas looked through the gate. It led to a narrow alleyway behind the church. The alley was empty. The thief was gone. Thomas felt angry with himself. He was the night watchman, and he had let the criminal escape. He went back inside the church to check on Father John again. The priest's eyes were now halfway open. He was trying to speak. Thomas knelt beside him and held his head up gently. "The cross." Father John whispered. His voice was very dry. He took it. The man with the shadow. "Who was it, Father?" Thomas asked. "Did you see his face?" Father John shook his head slowly. "Too dark, but he wore a ring. A red stone ring." Father John's eyes closed again. He was exhausted. Thomas knew he could not wait any longer. He had to get the doctor and the mayor. The golden cross was gone, the priest was hurt, and the only clues were a piece of blue silk, a silver button, and a memory of a red ring. Thomas ran through the dark streets of Oakhaven. He reached the house of Dr. Miller and knocked loudly on the heavy wooden door. After a minute, A window opened upstairs. An old man with a nightcap looked out. "Thomas, what is happening at this hour?" Dr. Miller asked. He looked very tired. "It is Father John. He is hurt in the church," Thomas shouted. "And the golden cross is gone." The doctor's face went pale. He closed the window quickly. A few moments later, he opened the front door. He carried a small bag of medicines. Together, they ran back to the great church. The cold air burned Thomas's lungs, but he did not stop. Inside the church, the doctor immediately knelt beside Father John. He checked the priest's pulse and looked at the mark on his neck. "He was hit with something heavy," the doctor said. "He needs rest and warmth. Help me carry him to his bed." They moved the priest to a small, warm room behind the altar. Once the priest was safe, Thomas went back to the main hall. He was not alone anymore. Lord Richard, the mayor of Oakhaven, stood by the empty altar. He was a large man with a very expensive fur coat. He looked at the empty stone table with wide eyes. "How did this happen, Thomas?" Lord Richard asked. His voice was loud and angry. "You are the watchman. You are paid to keep this town safe." "The lock was broken, my lord," Thomas explained. He stood tall, though his heart was heavy. "I followed a man into the garden, but he escaped through the back gate. He was very fast." Lord Richard walked around the altar. "This is a disaster. The Golden Cross is the heart of Oakhaven. It was a gift from the king's father. If it is not found, the king will be very angry with us." Thomas looked at the empty space. The Golden Cross was made of solid gold and covered in bright red rubies. It was beautiful and very heavy. He wondered how one man could carry it and run so fast. "I found these," Thomas said. He showed the piece of blue silk to the mayor. He decided to keep the silver button with the lion in his pocket for now. He wanted to look at it more closely later. The mayor took the silk and looked at it under the lantern light. He frowned. "This is expensive cloth. This did not belong to a common thief. Only a few people in this town can buy silk like this." "Father John saw a ring," Thomas added. "A ring with a red stone." Lord Richard's hand went to his own chest. He looked worried. "Many people have rings, Thomas. We must be careful. We cannot accuse the wrong person. But we must find that cross before the sun is high in the sky." Thomas nodded. He knew the mystery was just beginning. The thief was someone with money and power. As the first light of morning touched the church windows, Thomas felt the weight of the silver button in his pocket. It felt very heavy. The sun rose slowly over the stone walls of Oakhaven. The light was grey and cold. Usually, the morning was a happy time. The smell of fresh bread usually filled the air. But today, the town was quiet and sad. News of the missing Golden Cross moved fast. People stood in small groups. They whispered to each other. They looked at the great church with worried eyes. Thomas did not go home to sleep. He was tired, but his mind was busy. He walked to the market square. He needed to find out who owned a blue silk coat or a red stone ring. His first stop was the shop of Robert the blacksmith. Robert was a very strong man with large hands. He was already working. The sound of his heavy hammer hitting metal was very loud in the quiet morning. "Good morning, Robert," Thomas said. He stood near the warm fire of the forge. Robert stopped working and wiped sweat from his forehead. "It is a bad morning, Thomas. Is it true? Is the Golden Cross really gone?" "It is true," Thomas answered. "The lock on the church door was broken with a heavy tool." "Does anyone have a tool like that?" Robert looked at his own tools. "Many people have hammers and iron bars. But my tools are all here. I do not lend them to anyone." Thomas nodded. Then he looked at Robert's hands. Robert wore no rings. He wore a simple, dirty apron made of thick leather. He did not look like a thief who wore silk. "One more thing," Thomas said. "Have you seen anyone wearing a red stone ring lately?" Robert thought for a moment. A red stone. That sounds like jewelry for a rich man. Maybe the merchants at the inn. Or someone from the manor. Thomas thanked him and walked to the other side of the square. He went to see Mistress Elena. She was the town's best weaver. She sold fine cloth to the wealthiest people in Oakhaven. Her shop was full of bright colors and soft fabrics. Thomas took the small piece of blue silk from his pocket. "Mistress Elena, do you know this cloth?" The woman took the silk and held it near the window. She felt the material with her fingers. "This is very fine silk, Thomas. It comes from a distant land across the sea. It is very expensive." "Who in town bought a coat made of this?" Thomas asked. Mistress Elena frowned. "I only sold this specific blue silk to 3 people. One was the mayor, Lord Richard. The second was the master of the guard, Sir Gilbert. And the third." She paused, looking nervous. "And the third?" Thomas prompted. "The third was the merchant, Master William," she whispered. "But he left town 2 days ago. Or so he said." Thomas felt a spark of excitement. He had 3 names. He thanked Mistress Elena and stepped back into the street. He looked at the silver button in his hand. It had a lion on it. The mayor and the master of the guard both used the lion symbol. The mystery was getting deeper. He decided to visit the local tavern, the Silver Flagon, to see if anyone had seen Master William. Thomas began to walk toward the tavern, but his feet felt heavy. He kept thinking about Robert the blacksmith. Robert was a good man, but he had looked very nervous during their conversation. Thomas stopped and turned around. He decided to watch the forge from a distance. He hid behind a large wooden cart filled with hay. From there, he had a clear view of the blacksmith's shop. The orange glow of the fire lit up the street. Thomas waited for 10 minutes. Suddenly, Robert came out of the front door. He looked to the left and then to the right. He looked very worried. Robert did not see Thomas. The blacksmith walked quickly to a small pile of coal near the side of the building. He began to dig into the coal with his bare hands. After a moment, he pulled out a long, heavy object wrapped in a dirty cloth. He carried it back inside the shop and closed the door. Thomas did not wait. He ran to the door and pushed it open. The heat from the fire hit him immediately. Robert was standing by his workbench. He was trying to hide the cloth behind his back. "Robert," Thomas said firmly, "show me what you have." Robert's face went red. "It is nothing, Thomas. Just a broken tool." "A broken tool does not need to be hidden in a pile of coal," Thomas replied. He walked closer. "The golden cross is missing, and a priest is hurt. This is not the time for secrets. If you are my friend, show me." Robert sighed. He looked very tired. He slowly placed the object on the workbench and removed the cloth. It was a heavy iron crowbar. The end of the tool was bent and scratched. But the most important thing was the color. There were tiny, bright yellow flakes caught in the rough metal. "Is that gold?" Thomas asked. He touched the metal. The yellow flakes sparkled in the firelight. "I found it this morning," Robert whispered. His voice was shaking. "It was lying in the tall grass near the church garden. I recognized the tool. I made this crowbar myself 2 months ago." Thomas looked at Robert. "Who did you make it for?" Robert looked down at his boots. "I made it for Sir Gilbert, the master of the guard. He said he needed it to open some old crates in the storage room." Thomas felt a chill. Sir Gilbert was one of the 3 people who bought the blue silk. He was also a man with a lot of power. If Sir Gilbert was the thief, Thomas was in great danger. "Why did you hide it, Robert?" Because I was afraid. Robert cried out. If I told you it was Sir Gilbert's tool, he would kill me. He is a dangerous man. Thomas. He has many soldiers. Thomas took the iron bar and wrapped it back in the cloth. You did the right thing by telling me now. Stay here. Do not tell anyone we spoke. Thomas left the forge. The mystery was becoming a dark path. He had a piece of silk, a silver button, and now a tool that belonged to the master of the guard. He needed to find Sir Gilbert, but he had to be very careful. Thomas walked away from the blacksmith's shop. He kept the heavy iron bar hidden under his wool coat. The weight of the metal was cold against his side. He did not go to the tavern yet. Instead, he went back to the great church. He wanted to look at the garden gate one more time. The sun was higher now, but the air was still freezing. Most of the snow in the main street was messy because of the townspeople and their horses. But the narrow alleyway behind the church was different. It was a quiet place where few people walked. Thomas reached the small wooden gate. He looked down at the ground. There was a thin layer of fresh snow from the night. He saw a line of footprints. They started at the gate and went down the alley. Thomas knelt down to look closer. The footprints were large. The person who made them was heavy or wearing big boots. Thomas followed the tracks slowly. He noticed something very interesting about the left foot. The heel of the boot had a small, sharp mark. It looked like a tiny V shape. This is a good clue. Thomas said softly. Only one pair of boots will have this mark. The footprints led him out of the alley and toward the north side of the town. This was the rich part of Oakhaven. The houses here were tall and made of stone and dark wood. The tracks did not stop at a house. They continued toward a small, old stone building near the town wall. It was the old granary, a place where the town kept extra grain. Now, it was mostly empty. Thomas followed the tracks all the way to the granary door. The footprints went straight to the entrance. Then, he saw something else. There was a second set of footprints coming from the opposite direction. These footprints were smaller and more elegant. They did not have any special marks, but they were made by expensive shoes. The two sets of footprints met at the door of the old granary. Then, they both went inside. Thomas looked at the heavy wooden door. It was closed, but it was not locked. He could see a small sliver of light coming from the gap under the door. Thomas felt his heart beat fast. He was alone, and he only had his spear and a hidden crowbar. He knew he should probably go and find more guards. But the guards worked for Sir Gilbert. Could he trust them? If Sir Gilbert was inside, Thomas might be walking into a trap. He put his ear against the cold wood of the door. He did not hear any loud noises. He heard two voices. They were speaking very quietly. He could not hear the words, but he knew one voice was deep and strong. The other voice was lighter and sounded like a woman. Thomas gripped his spear. He had to know who was inside. He pushed the door very slowly. It did not make a sound. Thomas pushed the door very slowly. He did not want the hinges to make a sound. The air inside the old granary was thick with the smell of dry grain and dust. He could see a small light coming from behind a tall pile of wooden crates. He moved like a shadow. He kept his back against the stone wall. His heart was hitting his chest like a drum. He reached the edge of the crates and looked around the corner. Two people stood near a small lantern. The first was a tall, strong man. He wore a dark blue silk coat that looked black in the dim light. This was Sir Gilbert, the master of the guard. Thomas looked at the man's hands. On his right hand, there was a heavy gold ring with a large red stone. It was exactly as Father John had described. The second person was a woman. She wore a long green dress and a warm fur cloak. It was Lady Catherine, the wife of the mayor. She looked very nervous. Her hands were moving quickly, and she kept looking toward the door. "Is it done?" Lady Catherine asked. Her voice was thin and shaking. "It is done," Sir Gilbert answered. His voice was deep and cold. "The cross is safe for now. No one will find it in the old well." "But Father John saw you," she whispered. "What if he remembers your face?" Sir Gilbert stepped closer to her. The light from the lantern made his face look like a mask of stone. "The priest is old. His mind is weak. And if he speaks, nobody will believe him over the master of the guard." Thomas felt a wave of anger. These were the people who were supposed to protect Oakhaven. Instead, they were stealing from the church and hurting the priest. He wanted to run inside and arrest them. But he was only one man. Sir Gilbert was a trained soldier. "We must wait until the king's messenger arrives," Sir Gilbert continued. "Then we will take the cross out of the town. We will sell the rubies and melt the gold. We will be rich enough to leave this cold place forever." Lady Catherine nodded. "The mayor suspects nothing. He thinks a common thief took it. He is busy shouting at the guards." Thomas wanted to hear more, but he made a mistake. As he tried to get a better view, his foot hit an empty metal bucket on the floor. The bucket moved across the stone floor with a loud, metallic scrape. The sound was very loud in the silent granary. Sir Gilbert turned around instantly. His hand flew to the handle of his sword. "Who is there?" Sir Gilbert shouted. Thomas did not wait to answer. He turned and ran toward the door. He could hear Sir Gilbert's heavy boots running after him. The V mark on the boots was hitting the floor fast. Thomas burst out into the cold morning air. He had to hide, and he had to do it now. Thomas ran as fast as his legs could carry him. He did not look back. He turned into a narrow street and hid behind a large stack of firewood. He held his breath. A few moments later, he heard the heavy sound of Sir Gilbert's boots. The master of the guard stopped near the wood. Thomas saw the tip of a sword shining in the morning light. Sir Gilbert looked around, his face full of anger. He waited for a minute. Then he turned and walked back toward the granary. Thomas waited until the sound of the footsteps died away. He knew he was in great danger. He could not go to the guards for help. He decided to go to the mayor's house. He needed to see if Lord Richard was part of the plan. The mayor's house was the largest building in Oakhaven, after the church. It had tall windows and a heavy oak door. 2 guards stood outside, but they knew Thomas. They let him pass. Inside, the house was warm, but the air felt heavy with stress. Thomas found Lord Richard in his study. The room was filled with tall bookshelves and a large wooden desk. The mayor was pacing back and forth. His face was red, and his hair was messy. He looked like a man who had not slept at all. "Thomas!" Lord Richard cried when he saw the watchman. "Tell me you have good news. Tell me you found the golden cross." Thomas looked at the mayor. He looked truly worried. "I have found some clues, my lord," Thomas said carefully. He chose his words with caution. "I saw Sir Gilbert and Lady Catherine together near the old granary." Lord Richard stopped walking. He stared at Thomas. "My wife. Why was she with the master of the guard at an old granary?" "They were talking about the cross, my lord," Thomas said. He decided to tell the truth. "They said it is hidden in an old well. They want to sell the rubies and melt the gold." The mayor sat down heavily in his chair. He looked like he had been hit. "Catherine. My own wife." He put his head in his hands. "I knew she was unhappy in Oakhaven. She always wanted more money, more jewelry, but to steal the golden cross. That is a crime against the king and against God." Lord Richard looked up at Thomas. His eyes were wet. "If the king finds out, our family name is ruined. I will lose everything." The town will be punished. We must find the cross first. Thomas said, "There are many wells in Oakhaven. Do you know which one they meant?" The mayor shook his head. "There are 3 old wells that are no longer used. One is near the north wall, one is in the forest, and one is under the old tower." Suddenly, the door to the study opened. Lady Catherine walked into the room. She was smiling, but her eyes were cold. She looked at Thomas and then at her husband. "Is something wrong, Richard?" she asked smoothly. "You look very pale." Thomas felt his heart jump. He looked at her hands. She was not wearing her gloves anymore. On her finger, he saw a small mark where a ring usually sat, but the ring was gone. Lady Catherine stood in the doorway. She looked at Thomas with a sharp, cold gaze. Thomas felt very uncomfortable. He knew she was dangerous. He knew she was working with Sir Gilbert. "We were just discussing the security of the town walls, Catherine," Lord Richard said quickly. His voice was a little too high. He was not a good liar. "Thomas was telling me about the night watch." Lady Catherine walked into the room. Her silk dress made a soft sound as she moved. "Is that so? I thought the night watchman was busy looking for the Golden Cross. Why is he here in the middle of the day?" "I am finished for now, my lady," Thomas said. He bowed his head. He wanted to leave the room as fast as possible. "I must go home and rest. I will return to my walk tonight." "Wait," Lady Catherine said. She looked at Thomas's coat. "You have dust on your shoulder, Thomas. You should be more careful. It looks like the dust from the old granary." Thomas felt his heart stop. She had noticed. She knew he was at the granary. He did not look at her. "The whole town is dusty in the winter, my lady. Good day to you." "Good day, Lord Richard." Thomas walked out of the study. He walked quickly through the large stone hallways of the mayor's house. He did not stop until he was outside in the fresh air. He took a deep breath. The situation was getting very complicated. The mayor knew the truth, but his wife was a part of the crime. Who could Thomas really trust? As he walked toward his small house near the town wall, a man in a dark brown cloak stepped out from behind a tree. The man did not show his face. He held out a small, folded piece of paper. "This is for you," the man said. His voice was a low whisper. Before Thomas could ask a question, the man turned and disappeared into a narrow alley. Thomas looked at the paper. It was thick and expensive. There was no name on the outside. There was no wax seal. Thomas opened the paper. The handwriting was very neat and elegant. It was not the handwriting of a common person. It said, "The well under the old tower is deep, but it is not empty. Do not go alone. The lion has many teeth." Thomas read the words twice. "The lion has many teeth," he repeated. He thought about the silver button in his pocket. The lion was the symbol of the master of the guard and the mayor. The letter was a warning. Someone knew he was looking for the cross. Someone was trying to help him, or perhaps they were leading him into a trap. He looked toward the old tower. It stood on the highest hill of Oakhaven. It was a dark, lonely place. If the Golden Cross was there, he had to find it. But the letter said, "Do not go alone." He needed an ally. He thought of Father John. Was the priest strong enough to help? Or was there someone else in Oakhaven who hated Sir Gilbert? Thomas walked back to the great church. The sun was starting to move down the sky. He did not go to the main door. He went to the small side door where the monks lived. He needed someone he could trust. He knew Brother Paul, an old monk who spent all his time in the church library. Brother Paul knew the history of every family in Oakhaven. Thomas found the monk in a small, cold room. The walls were covered with old books and scrolls. Brother Paul was sitting at a wooden desk. He was writing with a long feather pen. The only sound in the room was the soft scratching of the pen on the paper. "Brother Paul," Thomas said quietly. The old monk looked up. He had very thick glasses and a kind smile. "Thomas, it is good to see you. I heard about the Golden Cross. It is a very dark day for our town." Thomas sat down on a small stool. He showed Brother Paul the silver button with the lion. "I found this in the church. I also received a letter that says, 'The lion has many teeth.' Do you know what this means?" Brother Paul took the button. He held it close to his eyes. He sighed deeply. The lion is the symbol of the House of Vane. Long ago, the Vane family was the most powerful family in this valley. They built the old tower on the hill. But they were greedy and cruel. The king took their land and their money 100 years ago. "Who belongs to the House of Vane now?" Thomas asked. "Sir Gilbert." Brother Paul answered. "He is the last of the Vanes. He does not use the family name because of the old shame. He moved here many years ago and became the master of the guard. But he still uses the lion on his private items." Thomas felt a shiver. So the lion is Sir Gilbert. And the teeth must be his soldiers. Brother Paul nodded. Sir Gilbert wants to be rich again. He wants to buy back his family's land. He is a man with a cold heart. Thomas. He will do anything to get what he wants. The letter says the cross is in the well under the old tower. Thomas whispered. Brother Paul looked worried. The old tower is a dangerous place. It is falling apart. And if Sir Gilbert is there, he will not be alone. He has 3 or 4 guards who are loyal only to him. They are not like the other guards. They are bad men. Thomas stood up. He knew what he had to do. I must go there tonight. I must find the cross before they move it. Brother Paul reached into his desk and pulled out a heavy iron key. This is for the secret door at the base of the tower. My order used to keep wine there. Use it. It is safer than the main entrance. Thomas took the key. It felt cold and heavy in his hand. He thanked the monk and left the church. The sun was setting, and the shadows were getting longer. He had a key, a spear, and a plan. But he also knew that the lion was waiting for him. Thomas went back to his small house near the town wall. He needed to prepare for the night. He put the iron key from Brother Paul on his wooden table. It was a large, old key with a circular head. He also looked at his spear and his lantern. He checked the oil in the lantern to make sure it would burn for many hours. He sat down for a moment and ate a piece of hard bread and some cheese. He was tired, but he could not sleep. His mind was full of images, the empty altar, the piece of blue silk, and the cold eyes of Lady Catherine. He knew that the old tower was a lonely place. If something happened to him there, nobody would hear his cries for help. I must be smart. Thomas whispered to himself. I'm not a soldier, but I know this town better than anyone. He took a thick piece of rope from a hook on the wall and tied it around his waist. He also took a small knife and hid it inside his boot. Finally, he put on his heavy coat and picked up the key. He stepped out into the night. The moon was bright and full. It turned the snow-covered roofs of Oakhaven into a sea of silver. Thomas did not walk on the main roads. He stayed in the shadows of the buildings. He moved toward the north side of the town, where the hill was steep. The old tower sat at the very top. It was a dark shape against the stars. The climb was difficult. The path was icy and narrow. Thomas had to move slowly so he did not slip. The wind was stronger here. It made a low, whistling sound as it moved through the dead trees. After 20 minutes of climbing, he reached the base of the tower. The tower was made of massive stones. Most of the windows were broken. The main door was at the front, but Thomas did not go there. He remembered Brother Paul's words. He walked around to the back of the tower. There were many thick bushes and tall weeds. Thomas pushed the bushes aside. His hands were cold, and the branches scratched his face. Finally, he saw it. There was a small, low door made of dark oak. It was almost hidden by the earth. It was the entrance to the old wine cellar. He knelt in the snow and held his lantern close to the lock. The lock was covered in orange rust. Thomas took the iron key and put it into the hole. It did not turn at first. He pushed harder. He felt the metal move. There was a loud, heavy sound of moving iron. The lock opened. Thomas pulled the door. It was very heavy. He had to use all his strength. When the door opened, a puff of dusty, warm air hit his face. It smelled of earth and very old wine. He looked into the darkness. A set of stone stairs led down into the ground. Thomas took a deep breath, held his lantern high, and stepped inside. Thomas walked down the stone stairs. The air was very still. His lantern was the only thing moving. The stairs ended in a small room with many empty wooden racks. This was where the monks once kept their wine. Now, it was full of spider webs and thick dust. Thomas moved carefully. He did not want to make any noise. At the end of the room, there was another set of stairs. These stairs went up. Thomas followed them and reached a small, heavy door. He pushed it open just a little bit. He saw that he was in a small courtyard inside the tower walls. This was the tower garden. But it was not a happy place. The trees were dead, and the bushes were tall and wild. The moon was still high in the sky. It cast long, dark shadows across the garden. Thomas stayed in the doorway. He looked around the courtyard. In the center of the garden, there was a circular stone structure. It was the old well. Suddenly, Thomas saw a movement. A shadow moved behind a large stone pillar near the well. Then, a second shadow appeared. These were not the shadows of trees. They were men. They wore the grey uniforms of the town guards. Thomas knew these men. They were Sir Gilbert's most loyal soldiers. The guards were talking. Thomas could not hear everything, but he heard enough. "The master says we move it at midnight." One guard whispered, "The horses are ready at the north gate." "I do not like this place." The second guard said. He looked at the dark tower. "It feels like someone is watching us." "It is just the wind." The first guard replied, "Help me check the rope. We cannot drop it into the water." The two men walked to the well. They carried a thick rope and a heavy wooden bucket. They began to lower the bucket into the dark hole of the well. Thomas watched from the shadows. His heart was racing. He knew the golden cross was down there. Sir Gilbert had hidden it in the one place no one would look. Thomas had to think fast. He was only one man, and there were two guards. If he attacked them now, they would scream for help. More guards were probably inside the tower. He needed to find a way to get the cross without being caught. He looked at the wall of the tower. There was a small window about 10 feet above the ground. If he could climb to that window, he could enter the main part of the tower. Maybe he could find a way to distract the guards from above. He stepped back into the cellar and closed the door quietly. He felt the cold stone of the wall. He needed a plan, and he needed it before midnight. The lion's teeth were right in front of him, and they were very sharp. He decided to go back through the secret tunnel to the town. He needed one more person to help him. He needed someone who knew how to fight. Thomas walked quickly down the hill. He did not go to his house. He went straight to the center of the town. The Silver Flagon was the largest tavern in Oakhaven. Even late at night, the windows were bright with orange light. As Thomas pushed the heavy door open, The smell of roasted meat and strong ale hit his face. The room was full of noise. Men were talking, laughing, and hitting their wooden cups against the tables. Thomas looked around the room. He did not want to be seen by the mayor's guards. He kept his hood over his head. In a corner, near the large stone fireplace, he saw the man he was looking for. His name was Mark. Mark was a big man with a thick black beard and a long scar on his arm. He used to be a soldier for the king, but now he worked as a woodcutter. He was honest, strong, and he did not like Sir Gilbert. Thomas sat down at the table. Mark looked up and smiled. "Thomas, you look like you have seen a ghost. Sit, have a drink." "I cannot drink, Mark," Thomas said in a low voice. He leaned closer across the table. "I need your help. I found the golden cross." Mark stopped smiling. He put his cup down slowly. He looked around the tavern to see if anyone was listening. The men at the next table were busy singing a loud song. "Where is it?" Mark whispered. "It is in the well at the old tower." Thomas said. "Sir Gilbert and Lady Catherine took it. They plan to move it at midnight. Sir Gilbert has his best guards there. I cannot take them alone." Mark's eyes turned hard. He hated the way Sir Gilbert treated the people of Oakhaven. The master of the guard is a thief. I always knew he was a bad man. But the tower is a fortress. "Thomas, how do we get inside?" "I have a key to the cellar," Thomas explained. "And I know the way through the garden. If we go now, we can stop them before the horses arrive." Mark nodded. He stood up and pulled his heavy leather belt tighter. "I have my old sword at home. It is sharp and ready. I will meet you at the north gate in 10 minutes. We will show the lion that he cannot steal from this town." "Be careful, Mark," Thomas warned. "The guards are armed, and they are dangerous." "I'm not afraid of Gilbert's dogs," Mark said with a grin. He walked out of the tavern into the cold night. Thomas stayed at the table for a moment. He felt a little better now that he was not alone. But as he stood up to leave, he saw a man standing by the bar. The man was wearing a grey guard uniform. He was watching Thomas with a dark expression. When Thomas looked at him, the guard turned away quickly and walked out the back door. Thomas felt a cold knot in his stomach. Had the guard heard them? If Sir Gilbert knew they were coming, the tower would not be a trap for the thief. It would be a trap for Thomas. Thomas walked quickly toward the north gate. The wind was getting stronger. It made a low, mourning sound as it passed through the stone arches of the town walls. The streets here were empty. Most people were staying inside to hide from the freezing cold. Thomas kept his hand on the heavy iron key in his pocket. He hoped Mark was already there. When he reached the gate, he did not see his friend. The area was very dark. The only light came from a single torch hanging on the wall. The flame was small and blue because of the wind. "Mark!" Thomas called out softly. He heard nothing but the wind. He walked toward a large stone pillar where they had agreed to meet. As he stepped around the corner, his boot hit something soft. He looked down and felt his heart freeze. A man was lying face down in the snow. Thomas knelt down immediately. He turned the man over. It was Mark. His face was pale, and there was a dark red stain on the snow beneath his head. He had been hit with something very heavy. Thomas checked for a pulse. Mark was still breathing, but he was unconscious, just like Father John. "No," Thomas whispered. "Not again." He looked at Mark's hand. Mark's old sword was still in its leather scabbard. He did not even have time to pull it out. This was not a fair fight. Someone had attacked him from behind. Thomas looked around the ground. He saw a set of footprints in the fresh snow. They were large, and one of them had a sharp V mark on the heel. Sir Gilbert had been here. The guard in the tavern must have told the master of the guard about Thomas and Mark's plan. Now, Mark was hurt, and Thomas was alone again. He felt a wave of guilt. He had put his friend in danger. Thomas looked at the injury on Mark's head. It was a clean strike. Then, he noticed something in Mark's closed fist. He gently opened the man's fingers. Inside was a small piece of paper. It was torn and dirty. Thomas held it up to the flickering torchlight. There were only 2 words written on it. The cellar. Thomas realized what happened. Mark must have arrived early. He probably saw the guards moving something. Maybe he tried to follow them and was caught. Suddenly, Thomas heard a loud sound from the direction of the old tower. It was the sound of many horses moving fast on the frozen ground. They were not coming toward the gate. They were moving away, toward the forest. They are moving the cross. Thomas said to himself. He had a choice. He could stay with Mark and call for the doctor, or he could follow the horses. If he stayed, the golden cross would be gone forever. If he followed, he might be the 3rd victim. He looked at his friend's quiet face. He knew what Mark would want him to do. Thomas stood up. He pulled his coat tight and gripped his spear. He did not go to the tower. He ran toward the north gate. He needed to find where those horses were going. Thomas ran through the north gate. The path into the forest was dark and narrow. The tall trees stood like silent giants under the silver moon. Their branches were covered in white frost. Thomas could see the deep marks of horse hooves in the snow. There were many of them, and they were moving fast. He ran for a long time. His legs were tired, and his breath was heavy in the cold air. After a mile, the tracks led away from the main path. They went into a thick area of bushes. Thomas slowed down. He did not want the guards to hear his footsteps. He moved quietly, stepping on the soft snow between the trees. Suddenly, he saw a flickering orange light. He stopped and hid behind a large oak tree. A few yards away, there was a small clearing. A heavy wooden wagon stood in the middle of the clearing. 4 horses were tied to a nearby tree. 2 guards were standing by a small fire, trying to stay warm. In the back of the wagon, Thomas saw Sir Gilbert. The master of the guard was holding a lantern. He was looking at a large wooden box. The box was made of dark oak and had heavy iron bands around it. It was closed with a massive golden lock. "Is the road clear?" Sir Gilbert asked. His voice was sharp and impatient. "Yes, sir." One of the guards answered. "The mountain pass is open. We can reach the coast by tomorrow evening." "Good," Sir Gilbert said. He touched the dark box. "Once we are across the sea, no one can find us. The king will think the cross was destroyed or melted down." Sir Gilbert stepped down from the wagon and walked toward the fire. He started talking to the guards about the morning plan. This was Thomas's chance. He moved like a ghost, crawling through the tall, dead grass toward the back of the wagon. He reached the wooden wheel. He waited for a moment, listening to the fire and the low voices of the men. Then, he climbed slowly onto the wagon. The wooden floor made a very slight creaking sound, but the wind was loud enough to hide it. Thomas reached the locked box. He touched the wood. It was cold and damp. He looked at the golden lock. It was very beautiful and very strong. He knew he could not open it with his small knife. He needed a key, or he needed a very heavy tool. He looked around the wagon. Under a pile of grey blankets, he saw something hard. He pulled the blanket back. It was a leather bag. Inside the bag were several smaller items, a silver mirror, some gold coins, and a heavy iron key with a red ribbon tied to it. Thomas took the key. His hand was shaking. He put the key into the lock of the dark box. It fit perfectly. He turned the key slowly. There was a metallic sound as the lock opened. Thomas lifted the heavy lid of the box. Inside, he saw the sparkle of many red rubies. The golden cross lay on a bed of black velvet. It was even more beautiful than he remembered. But as he reached out to touch it, a shadow fell over him. "You are a very curious watchman, Thomas," a voice said. Thomas froze. He turned his head slowly. Sir Gilbert was standing right behind the wagon. He was holding a heavy sword, and his eyes were full of hate. Sir Gilbert smiled, but it was not a happy smile. The light from his lantern made his eyes look like two small, red fires. "You are very brave, Thomas," he said. His voice was low and dangerous. "Or perhaps you are just very stupid." He pointed his sword at Thomas's chest. The tip of the sharp metal was only an inch away from Thomas's wool coat. Thomas did not move. He looked at the two guards by the fire. They stood up and placed their hands on their own swords. "Why are you doing this, Sir Gilbert?" Thomas asked. He tried to keep his voice steady. "You are the master of the guard. You have a position of honor in Oakhaven." "Honor does not pay for land," Gilbert replied. He laughed, but it was a cold and dry sound. "I live in a stone house in a small, boring town. I serve a mayor who is weak and afraid. My family, the House of Vane, used to own everything from these woods to the high mountains. I want my power back. The king only listens to men who have gold and jewels." Thomas looked down at the box again. The golden cross was beautiful, but he noticed something else. Under the cross, there was a piece of thick, yellow paper. It was an old map, and it looked very important. He could see a drawing of the town of Oakhaven. There were strange red lines drawn across the paper. These lines did not follow the streets. They went under the buildings. One red line started at the great church and ended at the old tower. "What is this map?" Thomas asked. He pointed at the yellow paper. Sir Gilbert's face changed. He looked angry that Thomas had seen it. "That is none of your business, watchman. You will not live long enough to understand it." "The cross is not enough for you," Thomas said. He was beginning to understand the secret. There is something else under the town. Something much bigger than a single cross. "The Vane family had many secrets," Sir Gilbert said. He stepped closer to the wagon. "The golden cross is more than just gold. It is the key to the real treasure of my ancestors. Now, step out of the wagon. I do not want to get your blood on the black velvet." Thomas knew he had to act now. He still had the heavy iron key in his hand. He also had his spear leaning against the side of the wagon. He saw the guards walking toward him. "I cannot let you take it," Thomas said. Suddenly, Thomas reached down and grabbed the old map. At the same time, he pushed the heavy wooden lid of the box down with all his strength. The lid was very heavy and hit Sir Gilbert's arm. The master of the guard cried out in pain and dropped his lantern. The glass of the lantern broke on the wooden floor of the wagon. The oil inside caught fire immediately. Small orange flames began to grow and spread. The horses felt the heat and smelled the smoke. They became scared and started to pull the wagon. The guards shouted and ran toward the horses. In the confusion, Thomas jumped from the wagon into the thick, dark bushes. He fell into the cold snow and rolled down a small hill. He kept the old map hidden inside his coat. Behind him, he heard the guards trying to stop the horses. The fire on the wagon was getting bigger. Thomas did not look back. He ran as fast as he could into the dark trees. He had to read that map. He had to know what was hidden under the stones of Oakhaven. Thomas ran until his chest felt like it was on fire. He did not stop until the orange light of the burning wagon was far behind him. He found a large, hollow tree and crawled inside. It was dark and smelled of dry leaves, but it was safe. He sat on the ground and waited for his heart to slow down. He pulled the old map from his coat. He could not see much in the dark, so he used a small piece of flint to strike a spark against his knife. The tiny, brief light showed him the red lines again. They were definitely tunnels. One tunnel started at the old tower and went deep under the ground. It ended right beneath the center of the great church. "The treasure is not the cross," Thomas whispered. "The treasure is under the church." He knew he had to get back to the town. Sir Gilbert would be furious. The guards would search every house and every alley. Thomas had to move carefully. He left his hiding spot and walked through the deep woods toward the south wall of Oakhaven. There was a small hole near the base of the wall where the water ran out during heavy rain. It was a tight fit for a man of his size, but he managed to crawl through. Once inside the town, he stayed in the shadows. He reached the back of the great church. He wanted to check on Father John, but as he approached the side door, he stopped. The stone path was covered in dark spots. Thomas knelt down. The moon was bright enough for him to see clearly. The spots were fresh blood. The trail of blood led from the side door toward the main altar. Thomas felt a cold fear. Had the guards come back for the priest? He entered the church quietly. The air was thick and silent. He followed the red spots across the stone floor. They did not stop at Father John's room. Instead, they led to a large, heavy stone slab near the altar. The slab was moved. It was a massive piece of rock that usually required 4 men to lift. Now, it was pushed to the side, leaving a dark hole in the floor. The blood was on the edge of the stone. Thomas stood by the hole. He looked down. A set of very narrow, very old stairs went down into the earth. This was the entrance to the tunnels on the map. He heard a low moan from below. It was the sound of someone in great pain. "Father John." Thomas called out softly. There was no answer, only another low moan. Thomas knew he should find help, but there was no time. He gripped his spear and began to walk down the stairs. The stones were wet and slippery. As he went deeper, the air became warmer and smelled of damp earth and something metallic. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a small room. On the floor, a man was lying in a pool of blood. It was not Father John. It was one of Sir Gilbert's guards. The man was holding his side. He looked up at Thomas with terrified eyes. He did not want to share," the guard whispered. "Who?" Thomas asked, kneeling beside him. "The master," the guard said. He coughed, and more blood came from his mouth. "He found the door. He took the lady, and the key. He said the teeth were no longer needed." The guard's hand fell to the floor. He was dead. Thomas looked at the stone wall in front of him. There was a small, round hole in the center of the wall. It was the shape of a key. Specifically, the shape of the iron key with the red ribbon. Thomas stood in the dark room under the church. The air was heavy and cold. The dead guard lay at his feet. Thomas felt a strange sensation. It was the feeling of eyes on his back. He turned his head slowly. He did not see anything in the shadows, but he felt the presence of another person. "Who is there?" Thomas asked. His voice was a tiny whisper. He did not want Sir Gilbert to hear him from the tunnels ahead. There was no answer. Only the sound of a small water drop hitting the stone floor echoed in the silence. Thomas decided to move. He could not stay with the dead man. He looked at the round hole in the wall again. It was a lock, but he did not have the key with the red ribbon. Sir Gilbert had that. However, Thomas still had the iron crowbar from the blacksmith. He pulled it from his coat. It was a strong tool. He put the end of the crowbar into the gap beside the stone door. He pushed with all his strength. His muscles hurt, and his face went red. The stone was very heavy, but it was old. With a loud, grinding sound of rock against rock, the door moved an inch. Thomas heard a sudden movement behind him. A boot hit a loose stone. "I know you are there," Thomas shouted. He turned around and held his spear ready. A figure stepped out from the darkness of the stairs. It was not a soldier. It was Lord Richard, the mayor. He looked terrible. His expensive fur coat was dirty and torn. He was holding a small candle that was almost finished. His eyes were wide with a mix of fear and anger. "Thomas," the mayor said. He was breathing hard. "I followed you from the church. I saw the blood. I saw the hole in the floor." "My lord, it is dangerous here," Thomas said. He lowered his spear. "Sir Gilbert is ahead. He has your wife, and he has the cross." Lord Richard walked closer. He looked at the dead guard and turned his face away. "Gilbert is a monster. I knew he was ambitious, but I did not know he was a killer. And Catherine. I cannot believe she helped him." "They are looking for a treasure," Thomas explained. He showed the mayor the old map. "This map shows tunnels. They lead to something under the town. Something the House of Vane lost a long time ago." The mayor looked at the map. His hands were shaking. "The Vane treasure. It is a legend in Oakhaven. People say it is a room full of gold and old crowns. But the way was lost when the old tower burned down a century ago." "The golden cross is the key," Thomas said. "Sir Gilbert said it opens the final door." Suddenly, they heard a scream. It was a woman's voice. It came from deep inside the tunnel, behind the stone door. It was Lady Catherine. She sounded terrified. "Catherine!" the mayor cried. He did not wait for Thomas. He pushed past the watchman and ran toward the small opening in the wall. Thomas grabbed his lantern and the crowbar. He had to follow. He was worried that the mayor was walking into a trap. As they entered the narrow tunnel, Thomas noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the dust. But they were not Gilbert's footprints. There was a third person in these tunnels, someone who moved silently and left almost no mark. Thomas felt the hair on his arms stand up. They were being followed, and the person behind them was much better at hiding than the mayor. Thomas and the mayor ran through the narrow tunnel. The walls were wet and covered in green moss. The air felt very thin. Up ahead, the tunnel opened into a large, circular room. It was an ancient chamber made of black stone. In the center of the room, Sir Gilbert stood near a stone pedestal. He was holding the golden cross. Lady Catherine was there, too. She was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall. Her face was pale, and she was crying. Her beautiful green dress was covered in dirt. "Richard!" she screamed when she saw the mayor. "Help me!" Sir Gilbert turned around. He looked tired, and his dark blue coat was stained with dust. He held a sharp dagger in one hand and the cross in the other. "Stay back, Richard. Do not come any closer." Lord Richard stopped. He looked at his wife and then at his friend. "Gilbert, stop this madness. You have the cross. Just leave her alone and go." "I cannot go yet," Sir Gilbert said. His voice was loud and wild. "The cross is not just a treasure. Look." He pointed to the top of the stone pedestal. There was a cross-shaped hole in the stone. It was the exact size of the golden cross. "The map was right," Sir Gilbert whispered. "This is the heart of the Vane family. My grandfather told me about this room. If I put the cross in the hole, the floor will open. The real gold is down there. Thousands of coins. Enough to buy a kingdom." "It is a trap, Gilbert," Thomas shouted. He held his lantern high. He looked at the floor around the pedestal. He saw small, thin lines in the stone. "This room is old and dangerous. If you move that stone, the whole church might fall down on us." Sir Gilbert did not listen. He was looking at the gold. He was looking at the rubies. He was a man who had lost his mind to greed. He lifted the golden cross and prepared to push it into the hole. "No!" Lady Catherine jumped up. She tried to grab his arm. The guard said there is a curse. He said the ceiling will collapse. Sir Gilbert pushed her away. She fell back against a heavy wooden lever on the wall. As she hit the lever, it moved down. Suddenly, the whole room began to shake. Small stones fell from the ceiling. A deep, low sound echoed through the tunnel. It was the sound of heavy machinery moving after 100 years. "What did you do?" Lord Richard cried. He ran to his wife and pulled her away from the wall. Thomas looked up. A massive iron gate began to drop from the ceiling, right between them and the exit. "We have to leave now," Thomas shouted. But Sir Gilbert was not looking at the gate. He was pushing the golden cross into the pedestal. He did not care about the shaking walls or the falling stones. He only cared about the treasure. "It's opening," Gilbert shouted. As the cross clicked into place, the floor beneath the pedestal started to slide away. But instead of a room full of gold, a dark, cold wind blew up from the hole. It smelled like salt and old bones. The floor beneath the pedestal continued to slide open. Sir Gilbert leaned forward, his eyes wide with hunger for gold. But as the stone moved, it revealed only a dark, hollow space. There were no piles of coins. There were no crowns or jewels. Instead, the lantern light showed only a deep pit filled with freezing water. "Where is it?" Sir Gilbert screamed. His voice was full of pain and disbelief. "Where is the treasure of the veins?" He reached into the hole, searching the edges with his hands. Suddenly, the stone floor beneath his feet became unstable. The shaking of the room grew more violent. A large crack appeared in the ceiling, and dust rained down on them. "Gilbert, get away from there!" Lord Richard shouted. He was holding Lady Catherine tightly. But Sir Gilbert did not move. He was staring at something inside the pit. Thomas stepped closer, keeping his balance as the ground moved. He looked into the dark water. Floating on the surface was a small, wooden box, but it was rotted and broken. Inside were only old bones and a rusted iron seal. It was never gold, Thomas realized. His voice was loud enough to be heard over the rumbling. The treasure was just the family's history, the records of their names. Sir Gilbert turned his head. His face was twisted with rage. "No. My grandfather said there was gold. He promised me." Suddenly, a large stone fell from the ceiling and hit the pedestal. The golden cross was crushed under the weight of the rock. With the cross broken, the machinery of the room began to fail. The sliding floor jerked and then stopped, leaving Sir Gilbert balanced on a thin edge of stone. "Thomas, the gate!" Lord Richard yelled. Thomas looked back. The heavy iron gate was almost closed. Only a small gap remained at the bottom. If they did not leave in the next few seconds, they would be trapped in this dark chamber forever as the church above them collapsed. "Come on!" Thomas grabbed the mayor's arm and pulled him toward the exit. Lady Catherine followed, her face white with terror. Thomas looked back one last time at Sir Gilbert. The master of the guard was still reaching for the broken cross under the fallen stone. He did not seem to care about the falling ceiling. He was lost in his own mind. "Gilbert! Run!" Thomas called out. But another loud sound filled the room, the sound of a massive stone beam breaking. The center of the ceiling gave way. A wall of dust and rock fell between Thomas and the master of the guard. Thomas had to turn away. He dived under the iron gate just as it hit the floor with a final, heavy thud. They were safe in the tunnel, but the room behind them was silent. The lion was gone, buried with the secrets of his ancestors. Thomas, Lord Richard, and Lady Catherine walked slowly through the dark tunnel. Their clothes were covered in thick grey dust. No one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the scraping of their boots on the wet stone. They reached the narrow stairs that led back up to the main floor of the great church. Thomas went first. holding his lantern high to light the way. When they stepped back into the church, the air was heavy and smelled of old stone. The earthquake from the machinery below had caused damage. There were large cracks in the beautiful stone pillars. Pieces of the ceiling lay on the floor like broken teeth. The great church, once a place of perfect peace, now looked like a battlefield. "Is it over?" Lady Catherine whispered. She was leaning on her husband's arm. Her face was still very white. "It is over for Gilbert," Lord Richard said. His voice was sad. He looked at the hole in the floor where the stone slab used to be. "But the town will have many questions. The Golden Cross is gone, and the Master of the Guard is dead." Thomas did not answer. He was looking at the small room where Father John usually rested. The door was wide open. Thomas felt a sudden worry. He ran to the room, but the bed was empty. Father John was not there. The priest. "He is gone," Thomas shouted. The mayor and his wife followed him into the small room. It was a simple room with a wooden bed and a small desk. Thomas looked at the far wall. There was a large window with beautiful colored glass. But now, the window was completely destroyed. Shards of red, blue, and yellow glass covered the floor and the grass outside. Did the shaking break the window? Lady Catherine asked. Thomas knelt and looked at the frame. "No," he said, pointing to the wood. "The glass is all on the outside. In the garden. This window was broken from the inside. Someone used a heavy object to smash it and jump out." He looked at the floor near the bed. He saw a small, wooden bowl. It was the bowl the doctor used for Father John's medicine. It was broken in 2 pieces. There were also fresh footprints in the dust on the floor. These were not the large boots of a guard. These were the footprints of a man wearing soft, light shoes. Father John was too weak to move. Lord Richard said, shaking his head. He could not break a window and jump. Then someone took him. Thomas said. He felt a cold chill. The mystery was not finished with Sir Gilbert's death. Someone wanted the priest out of the church. But why? Thomas stepped through the broken window into the church garden. The moon was starting to set, and the sky was turning a dark purple. In the middle of the garden, he saw something bright. He walked to a rose bush and reached inside. He pulled out a small silver crucifix. It belonged to Father John. It was tied to a piece of black string, but the string was torn. He tried to leave a trail. Thomas said to himself. He looked toward the town walls. The footprints in the garden did not go toward the mayor's house or the tavern. They went toward the old library near the monks' quarters. Thomas walked quickly toward the old library. The air was very still, but his heart was racing. Lord Richard and Lady Catherine followed him, though they stayed a few steps behind. The mayor looked exhausted, and his wife kept looking at the dark corners of the garden. "Thomas, wait." Lord Richard called out. "We should find the remaining guards. We need men with torches." "There is no time, my lord," Thomas replied without stopping. "If Father John is in danger, every minute matters." They reached the library door. It was a small, heavy door made of dark wood. It was not locked. Thomas pushed it open slowly. The room inside was very tall and filled with the smell of old paper and dust. Hundreds of books sat on wooden shelves that reached the ceiling. In the center of the room, a single candle was burning on a large oak table. Beside the candle sat Brother Paul. The old monk was reading a large, thick book. He did not look up when they entered. "Brother Paul," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the large room. "Where is Father John? We found his room empty and the window broken." Brother Paul slowly turned a page. He looked very calm. "Father John is safe, Thomas. He is resting in the secret room behind the history shelves. He was afraid." Afraid of what? Lord Richard asked, stepping forward. Sir Gilbert is dead. The danger is over. Brother Paul finally looked up. His eyes were sharp behind his thick glasses. Is it, my lord? Sir Gilbert was a man of action, but he was not a man of plans. He was a tooth, as the letter said, but a tooth needs a brain to tell it when to bite. Thomas felt a cold sensation in his stomach. He looked at the old monk. You sent me that letter, didn't you? You knew about the well and the tower. I did. Brother Paul said. He stood up slowly. I have lived in this library for 40 years. I have read every letter and every map the Vane family ever wrote. I knew Gilbert would fail. He was too greedy and too loud. Then why did you help me? Thomas asked. Because I needed someone to find the path. Brother Paul whispered. I am an old man. I cannot move heavy stones or fight guards. But you, Thomas, you are the perfect watchman. You followed the clues exactly as I wanted. Suddenly, a door behind the shelves opened. 2 men stepped out. They were not town guards. They were wearing dark cloaks and carried sharp daggers. Between them was Father John. The priest's hands were tied, and his mouth was covered with a cloth. He looked at Thomas with eyes full of terror. Brother Paul, what is this? Lord Richard shouted. Release the priest at once. I am sorry, Richard. Brother Paul said, and for the first time, his voice was not kind. The Vane treasure was not gold. It was a secret. A secret about who truly owns the land of Oakhaven. That secret is in the book I am holding. With this, I can control the town. But I cannot have witnesses who know the truth about the tunnels. Thomas looked at the 2 men in cloaks. He realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had trusted the monk because he was a man of God. But in Oakhaven, even the library held shadows. Brother Paul held the heavy book close to his chest. His face did not look kind anymore. It looked greedy. You do not understand, Thomas. The monk said, This town belongs to the church, but the Vane family hid the documents long ago. With this book and the seal from the well, I can prove that I am the true ruler of Oakhaven. Not the mayor. Not the king. Lord Richard stepped forward. He was very angry. You are a monk, Paul. You should care about souls, not land. I care about power. Brother Paul replied. He looked at the 2 men in dark cloaks. Take them to the lower cellar. We cannot leave them here. The 2 men moved quickly. They were strong and fast. One man grabbed Thomas by the arm. The other man pushed the mayor and Lady Catherine toward the back of the library. Thomas tried to use his spear, but the man was too close. He dropped the spear on the wooden floor. They walked past the tall shelves of books. At the very end of the room, there was a large rug on the floor. One of the men pulled the rug away. Under the rug was a wooden trapdoor. He opened it, and Thomas saw a dark hole with a ladder. Go down. The man ordered. He pointed his knife at Thomas. One by one, they climbed down the ladder. It was a small, square room with stone walls. It was very cold and smelled of damp earth. Father John was already there, sitting on a wooden bench. He looked very tired and weak. Once they were all inside, the man pulled the ladder up and closed the trapdoor. They were trapped in the dark. The only light came from the small gaps in the wooden ceiling. Thomas heard the sound of a heavy lock turning above them. I am sorry, Thomas. Father John whispered. His voice was very thin. I tried to stop him. Brother Paul has been planning this for many years. He used Sir Gilbert to find the location of the well. He knew Gilbert would fail. We have to get out, Thomas said. He felt the stone walls with his hands. He was looking for something, anything. to help them. He moved to the corner of the room. The ground here felt different. It was not solid stone. It was soft dirt. He knelt down and started to dig with his hands. After a moment, his fingers hit something hard and cold. It was metal. "What is it, Thomas?" Lady Catherine asked. She was shivering in the cold. "It is a handle," Thomas said. He pulled with all his strength. There was a loud sound of metal moving against dirt. A small iron door, hidden under the soil, opened. A cold wind blew out of the hole. It was another tunnel. But this one was different. It did not go toward the church. It went deep under the town walls, toward the forest. "This is a secret tunnel," Thomas said. "The monks used it to escape during the old wars. If we follow this, we can get behind Brother Paul and his men." Lord Richard looked at the dark hole. "It looks very narrow, Thomas. Can we all fit?" "We have no choice," Thomas said. He helped Father John stand up. "I will go first with the lantern. Stay close to me." Thomas stepped into the secret tunnel. It was very small. He had to bend his back to move. The walls were made of rough earth and old wood. He could hear the sound of the wind whistling through the tunnel. They started to walk into the darkness, hoping this path would lead them to freedom, and not to another trap. The tunnel was very narrow and the ceiling was low. Thomas had to crawl on his hands and knees. Behind him, he heard the heavy breathing of Lord Richard. Lady Catherine was quiet, but she was moving slowly. Father John was at the back. Thomas felt bad for the old priest. This journey was very hard for a man who was hurt. The walls were made of cold, wet mud. Sometimes, a small stone fell from the ceiling. Thomas kept his lantern low. He did not want any light to escape from the ends of the tunnel. After many minutes of crawling, the tunnel became a little wider. They reached a small, circular room made of old bricks. Thomas stood up and stretched his back. He held his lantern high to see the room. He gasped. In the corners of the room, there were many wooden boxes and leather bags. "What is all this?" Lady Catherine asked. She stepped into the room and looked at a bag. It was open. Inside, there were silver plates and expensive candlesticks. Thomas opened a small wooden box. It was full of gold rings and jewelry with bright stones. "These are things that went missing in Oakhaven over the last 5 years," Thomas whispered. "People thought they were lost or stolen by travelers. But they were here, under the library." He looked at a pile of clothes in the corner. He saw a dark blue silk coat. He walked over and picked it up. There was a small piece of fabric missing from the bottom of the coat. Thomas took the piece of silk from his own pocket. It was a perfect match. Brother Paul was the thief, Thomas said. Sir Gilbert was working for him, but the monk was the one stealing from the houses at night. He used these tunnels to move unseen through the town. "He is not a man of God," Father John said sadly. "He is a man of greed. We must keep moving." Lord Richard said, "If he finds us here, he will kill us to keep his secret." Thomas looked at the far wall of the treasure room. There was another wooden door. It was small and had a heavy iron bolt. Thomas moved the bolt slowly. It made a dry, scraping sound. He pushed the door open and looked out. He saw large wooden barrels and the smell of strong ale. They were not in the forest. They were in the cellar of the Silver Flagon Tavern. This was how the monk knew everything. He could listen to the people in the tavern from below the floor. "Follow me," Thomas whispered. "But be very quiet. The tavern is full of people, and some of them might work for the monk." They stepped out of the treasure room and into the tavern cellar. Thomas could hear the sound of people laughing and singing above their heads. It was a strange feeling. Up there, life was normal. Down here, They were fighting for the future of the town. Thomas and his group stood among the large barrels of ale. The cellar was dark and cool. A single candle burned on a small crate in the far corner. A man sat there, hunched over a piece of paper. He was busy counting gold coins and writing in a ledger. He wore a fine brown coat and a hat with a soft feather. It was Master William, the merchant. "Master William," Thomas said. His voice was firm but low. The merchant jumped and dropped his pen. His face turned very pale when he saw the night watchman, the mayor, and the priest standing in the shadows. "Thomas." "Lord Richard. What are you doing here?" he asked. His voice was high and nervous. "Mistress Elena told me you left Oakhaven 2 days ago," Thomas said. He walked closer to the merchant. "Why are you hiding in the cellar of a tavern? A merchant should be on the road with his horses." Master William looked at the stairs and then at the door. He looked like he wanted to run, but Lord Richard stood in his way. The mayor's face was full of anger. I had a problem with my wagon," William said. He tried to hide the gold coins with his hand. "I decided to stay one more night." Thomas reached out and pulled back the merchant's brown coat. Underneath, William was wearing a shirt made of dark blue silk. It was the same expensive material that Thomas had found at the church. "The silk does not lie, Master William," Thomas said. "And neither do the boxes in the room behind you. We found the treasure. We know about the tunnels." The merchant collapsed onto his stool and put his head in his hands. "The monk forced me," he cried. "Brother Paul told me he had old items from the church library that he wanted to sell in the city. He told me the money was for the poor. I did not know he was stealing from the townspeople." "Did you help him take the golden cross?" Lord Richard asked. "No." William shook his head quickly. "That was Sir Gilbert's job. My job was only to move the smaller boxes. I was waiting here for the monk to give me a signal. I have a wagon waiting behind the tavern. The guards at the north gate do not check my wagon because I pay them extra gold." Thomas looked at the group. He saw a chance to win. "If the guards do not check your wagon, then you can help us. We need to move the stolen treasure into the town square. We need the people of Oakhaven to see the truth." "Brother Paul will kill me," William whispered. "The people will protect you if you tell the truth," Thomas replied. "But if you stay here, you are a thief. What is your choice, Master William?" The merchant looked at the gold on the table and then at Father John. He looked ashamed. "I will help you," he said. "The wagon is ready. We can load the boxes now." Thomas and Master William began to move the heavy boxes. They were very quiet. Lord Richard helped too. Lady Catherine stayed near Father John to keep him safe. The secret room was full of things that did not belong to the monk. They carried the boxes through the small door and into the main cellar of the tavern. Suddenly, the wooden stairs at the back of the cellar moved. Someone was coming down. Thomas quickly hid behind a large barrel of ale. Lord Richard and the others stood in the shadows. A man appeared at the bottom of the stairs. It was Peter, the owner of the Silver Flagon. He was a short man with a red face and a big stomach. He was carrying a tray with a glass bottle and 4 silver cups. He did not look surprised to see Master William. "Master William," Peter said with a strange smile. "I heard voices. I thought you might be thirsty before your long journey." "I am busy, Peter," William said. He looked very nervous. His hands were shaking. "Nonsense," Peter replied. He walked toward the table where the merchant's ledger sat. He started to pour a dark, red wine into the silver cups. "A gift from Brother Paul," he said. "It is a special wine from the south. It helps a man sleep very deeply." Thomas watched from behind the barrel. He did not like the way Peter mentioned Brother Paul. And he did not like the phrase, "sleep very deeply." In the dark cellar, the wine looked almost black. It smelled very sweet, like flowers and honey. Peter handed a cup to Master William. Then he looked into the shadows. "I know you are there, Lord Richard. And you too, Thomas. Do not be afraid. We are all friends here." Lord Richard stepped into the light. He was very tired. He reached for a cup of wine. "I am thirsty." The mayor said, "It has been a very long night." "Wait!" Thomas shouted. He jumped out from behind the barrel and knocked the cup out of the mayor's hand. The silver cup hit the stone floor. The red wine splashed across the ground. The wine did not look like normal wine. Where it touched the stone, it began to sizzle. A small cloud of white smoke rose into the air. The smell was sharp and bitter. "It is poison!" Thomas cried. He grabbed his spear and pointed it at Peter. Peter's face went from red to white. He dropped the tray. The other cups and the bottle broke on the floor. The cellar was suddenly filled with the dangerous, sweet smell of the poisoned wine. Peter turned and tried to run up the stairs. "Stop him!" Lord Richard yelled. Master William was faster than he looked. He grabbed Peter's coat and pulled him back. The tavern owner fell onto the stone floor. "Who told you to do this?" Thomas asked. He held the tip of his spear near Peter's neck. "The monk!" Peter cried. "Brother Paul said you were all enemies of the town. He said if I gave you the wine, he would give me enough gold to buy 10 taverns." Thomas looked at the sizzling mess on the floor. Brother Paul was not just a thief and a liar. He was a murderer. They had to act fast before the monk realized his plan had failed. The smell of the poisoned wine was still strong in the cellar. Thomas helped the mayor move away from the white smoke. They tied Peter to a large wooden post with a piece of thick rope. The tavern owner was crying and begging for mercy. Why would Brother Paul do this? Lady Catherine asked. She sat on a crate, her head in her hands. "He has lived in our town for so many years. We trusted him with our prayers and our secrets." Father John sat next to her. He looked at the floor, his eyes full of sadness. "I remember something now," the priest said. His voice was very quiet. "It was 40 years ago. There was a young boy who lived in the forest. His family was very poor. They said they were the last relatives of the Vane family." Thomas listened closely. He stopped moving the boxes. "Was that boy Brother Paul?" "I think so," Father John replied. "The town did not help his family. When his father died, the people took their small house. The boy disappeared. 10 years later, a new monk arrived at the library. He was quiet and very smart. We called him Brother Paul. He never spoke about his past. He waited 40 years for revenge." Lord Richard said. He looked at the tied-up Peter. He didn't just want the gold. He wanted to destroy the people who took his home. Thomas looked at the map again, and he used the golden cross to find the secret chamber. He knew the history better than anyone. He knew that the treasure was just a symbol, but the power was in the documents. "We must go to the town square," Thomas said firmly. "The sun will rise soon. People will wake up. If they see the mayor and the priest are safe, and they see the stolen goods, the monk will lose his power." Master William, the merchant, stood up. He looked brave for the first time. "My wagon is in the alley. We can put the boxes inside and cover them with blankets. We will drive to the center of Oakhaven." They worked quickly. They loaded the silver plates, the jewelry, and the dark blue silk coats into the wagon. Thomas took his spear and stood at the back. Lord Richard and Lady Catherine sat next to the merchant. Father John lay in the back of the wagon on a bed of hay. As they drove out of the dark alley, the sky was turning a light grey. The town was still very quiet, but Thomas saw a light in the high window of the church library. The monk was awake. He was probably waiting for Peter to tell him that everyone was dead. "Keep the horses moving," Thomas whispered to Master William. "We have one chance to show the truth to Oakhaven." The wagon wheels moved slowly over the stone streets. The morning was very cold. Suddenly, a small drop of water hit Thomas on the nose. Then another drop fell. Within a minute, a light rain began to fall over Oakhaven. It was a cold, freezing rain that turned the snow into a grey mess. "The rain will wash away the tracks," Master William whispered. He pulled his hat lower over his eyes. The horses moved their heads. They did not like the wet weather. Thomas looked up at the sky. The clouds were thick and dark. He looked at the great church in the distance. The tall tower was hidden in the mist. He felt a sense of urgency. The rain made everything look sad and grey, but it also helped them. The sound of the rain hitting the roofs helped to hide the sound of their wagon. "We are almost at the square," Lord Richard said. He was holding a heavy blanket over Lady Catherine to keep her dry. "What is the plan, Thomas?" "The people will not be in the square during a storm. We will go to the town bell," Thomas replied. "Every town in this valley knows that when the great bell rings at an unusual time, everyone must gather, even in the rain." As they reached the center of the square, Thomas saw the tall wooden post with the iron bell. Usually, the bell rang for morning prayers or for a fire. He jumped down from the wagon. His boots splashed in a puddle of icy water. He looked at the great church again. He saw a shadow move in the library window. Brother Paul was still there. Thomas knew the monk was watching the square. He probably wondered why a merchant's wagon was stopping in the middle of the rain. "William, stay with the wagon," Thomas ordered. "Lord Richard, help Father John. I am going to ring the bell." Thomas ran toward the bell post. The rain was coming down harder now. His coat was heavy and wet. He grabbed the long rope. It was rough and cold in his hands. He pulled with all his strength. The bell made a loud, clear sound that echoed across the empty square. Thomas pulled again and again. The sound traveled through the narrow streets and into the houses. It woke the bakers, the blacksmiths, and the weavers. Windows began to open. People looked out into the rain. They saw the night watchman ringing the bell. They saw the mayor's wagon. Curiosity was stronger than the fear of the rain. Men and women began to put on their coats and step out into the street. "What is happening?" A man shouted from a doorway. "Is there a fire? Come to the square." Thomas shouted back. "The truth about the Golden Cross is here." He saw Brother Paul step out from the church door. The monk was wearing his long black robes. He was holding a wooden staff. He looked calm, but Thomas saw his hand shaking. The monk began to walk toward the square, and behind him, the two men in dark cloaks followed like shadows. The square was now full of people. They stood under the freezing rain, shivering and confused. Robert the blacksmith stood at the front of the crowd. He held a heavy hammer in his hand. Mistress Elena the weaver was there too, her face pale in the grey light. Everyone looked at the wagon and then at the great church. Brother Paul walked into the center of the square. He stood tall and held his wooden staff firmly. He looked like a holy man, calm and strong. "People of Oakhaven," he shouted. His voice was loud and clear. "Why are you out in this storm? Why is the night watchman ringing the bell like a madman?" Thomas stepped forward. His wet hair was stuck to his forehead. "We are here to show the truth, Brother Paul." We have found the items that were stolen from your houses." The monk laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. "Thomas is tired. The night has been too long for him. He found a merchant's wagon and thinks it is a treasure chest. Master William is just a traveler." Lord Richard stepped out from the side of the wagon. He looked at the crowd. "It is no mistake. My people. I am your mayor, and I tell you that this monk is not who he says he is." The crowd began to whisper. They did not know who to believe. Brother Paul was a man of the church, but the mayor was their leader. "Show them, Thomas," Father John said from the back of the wagon. His voice was weak, but the people heard him. They were shocked to see the priest hurt. Thomas walked to the back of the wagon. He pulled away the heavy wet blankets. Underneath, the wooden boxes were visible. He used his spear to push the lid of the largest box open. The crowd gasped. The silver plates and gold jewelry sparkled even in the dark, rainy morning. "This is my silver cup," a woman cried out from the crowd. "And that is my father's gold chain," another man shouted. Brother Paul's face turned red with anger. "The mayor put those things there. He stole them and wants to blame me." Thomas looked at the monk. He noticed something. The monk was wearing a heavy leather glove on his left hand. He had not worn that glove before. Thomas remembered the red stone ring that Father John described. Sir Gilbert had it. But Sir Gilbert was now under the stones of the tunnel. "Why are you wearing a glove, Brother Paul?" Thomas asked. "The rain is cold, but you only wear one. It is none of your business," the monk hissed. Thomas moved fast. He was a watchman, and he was used to catching thieves. He grabbed the monk's left arm. The two men in dark cloaks moved to attack, but Robert the blacksmith stepped forward with his hammer. The cloaked men stopped. Thomas pulled the leather glove off the monk's hand. On the monk's finger was a gold ring with a massive red stone. The red stone ring. Father John whispered, "The ring of the Vane family." "But wait," Thomas said. He looked closer at the ring. There was a small secret compartment on the side of the stone. He pushed it with his thumb. The stone moved, and inside was a small, sharp needle. "This is not just jewelry. This is how you hurt Father John and Mark. One scratch from this poison needle, and a man falls asleep." The people of Oakhaven looked at the ring and then at the monk. The evidence was complete. The lost ring of the Vane family was the weapon the monk used to commit his crimes. Brother Paul was no longer a man of God in their eyes. He was a predator. The crowd in the town square erupted in a mixture of gasps and angry shouts. The sight of the poisoned ring on Brother Paul's finger was the final proof they needed. Robert the blacksmith stepped forward, his massive hand gripping the monk's shoulder. "You have some explaining to do, brother," Robert growled. But Brother Paul was not finished. Even cornered, his eyes darted around the square like a trapped animal. He looked at the two men in cloaks, but they saw the angry crowd and the mayor's authority. They slowly backed away into the shadows of the rain-slicked alleyways, abandoning their master. "You think this is over?" Brother Paul hissed, looking directly at Thomas. "The gold is nothing. The jewelry is trash. You have no idea what is actually kept in the great church." Suddenly, the monk twisted his arm with surprising strength, striking Robert's chest with the heavy wooden staff. As the blacksmith stumbled back, Paul didn't run for the gates or the forest. He turned and ran back toward the great church library. "Stop him!" Lord Richard shouted. "He's going for the records." Thomas didn't wait for the guards. He sprinted after the monk, his boots splashing through the growing puddles. He reached the library doors just as they slammed shut. Thomas threw his shoulder against the oak wood. It was locked from the inside. The side window. Thomas remembered. He ran around the stone corner of the building, climbed a small garden wall, and dived through the broken window they had escaped from earlier. The library was silent, but the smell of smoke was beginning to fill the air. Thomas ran toward the central desk. Brother Paul was there, his back to Thomas. He was frantically throwing old, yellowed scrolls into the large stone fireplace. "The history of this town is mine to write," Paul screamed, his voice cracking. "If I cannot own Oakhaven, I will burn its memory." Thomas saw a thick, black-bound book resting on the table. The same book the monk had held earlier. This was the Vane Registry, the document that detailed the true lineage of every family in the valley. If it burned, the legal history of Oakhaven would be lost, causing chaos for generations. Thomas grabbed a heavy iron candle holder from a nearby shelf. He didn't use his spear. He didn't want to kill the man. He threw the candle holder with perfect aim. It struck the monk's wrist just as he reached for the black book. Paul cried out, and the book fell to the floor, sliding across the dusty wood. Thomas tackled the monk, pinning him to the floor. "The mystery ends here, Paul. No more lies. No more shadows." As Thomas held the struggling man, his eyes fell on the page the book had been opened to. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a map of the church's foundation, showing a second, even deeper level, a vault that even the Vane family map hadn't fully revealed. The library mystery wasn't just about the monk's identity. It was about what sat directly beneath their feet at that very moment. There was a final secret in Oakhaven, one that Brother Paul had been desperately trying to protect or destroy. Lord Richard and two guards burst through the library doors just as Thomas was dragging Brother Paul away from the fireplace. The room was filled with thick, white smoke, and the smell of charred paper stung their eyes. The monk was gasping for air, his eyes wide and wild, fixed on the black-bound book lying on the floor. "Secure him," the mayor commanded. The guards grabbed the monk's arms and forced him into a heavy wooden chair. Thomas picked up the Vane Registry. The leather was hot, but the pages were mostly safe. He turned to the map he had seen. "My lord, look," Thomas said, pointing to the diagram. "This isn't just a map of the church. It shows a hollow space directly beneath this library. It is labeled the heart of Oakhaven." Brother Paul let out a low, bitter laugh. "You have the book, but you don't have the courage to see what's inside. You think you are the masters of this town. You are living on a foundation of lies." Thomas looked at the floor. He noticed that the stone tiles directly beneath the central desk were slightly different in color, darker, as if they had been handled more often. He pushed the heavy oak desk aside with the help of the guards. Beneath it lay a circular iron hatch, rusted and covered in ancient dust. "Don't open it," Paul whispered, his voice suddenly small. "Some things are meant to stay in the dark." Lord Richard stepped forward. "Open it, Thomas. We have lived in the dark for too long." Thomas used his crowbar to pry the hatch open. It groaned with the weight of centuries. A blast of cold, stale air rushed out, smelling of parchment and dry earth. Thomas lit a fresh torch and led the way down a narrow spiral staircase. At the bottom, they entered a small, perfectly square chamber. Unlike the tunnels before, this room was beautiful. The walls were lined with white marble, and in the center stood a single stone pillar. Atop the pillar sat a small silver box, sealed with the royal crest of the old kings. "What is this?" the mayor asked, his voice full of awe. Thomas opened the silver box. Inside was a single, rolled document and a heavy golden seal. He unrolled the parchment and read the elegant script. His eyes widened. "It's not a treasure of gold, my lord. It's a royal charter. It says that Oakhaven was never meant to be a private land. The Vane family didn't lose the land to the king. They gave it to the people. This document proves that every citizen of Oakhaven owns their own home and land, free of any lord or master." Brother Paul screamed in rage. struggling against the guards upstairs. "It was our legacy. My family's blood built this town. It should be mine." "No," Thomas said, looking up toward the library. "It belongs to everyone. You wanted to burn this because it meant you could never truly rule us." The confrontation was over. The lion had no more teeth, and the monk had no more shadows to hide in. The true heart of Oakhaven was not gold, but freedom. Thomas looked at the document and then at Lord Richard. The mayor nodded slowly, a look of peace finally crossing his face. The rain stopped just as the first light of the sun began to break over the mountains. The grey clouds turned to gold and pink, and the air felt clean and new. In the center of the town square, the people of Oakhaven gathered once more. They were tired, but there was a new energy in the crowd, a feeling of hope that had been missing for a long time. Lord Richard stood on the steps of the town hall. He held the royal charter high for everyone to see. Beside him stood Father John, leaning on a wooden cane, and Thomas, the night watchman. "People of Oakhaven." The mayor's voice rang out. "The shadows that hung over our town are gone. Brother Paul and the remnants of Sir Gilbert's guard have been taken to the city to face the king's justice. But more importantly, we have found our true history." He read the words of the charter aloud. As the people realized that their homes were truly theirs, a great cheer rose up, louder than any bell. People hugged each other, and some even wept with relief. The fear that had gripped the town since the disappearance of the Golden Cross was finally replaced by a sense of belonging. Later that morning, Thomas walked to the great church. The damage from the night before was being repaired. Stone masons were already at work fixing the pillars. He found Father John sitting in the garden, watching the birds. "What will happen to the Golden Cross, Father?" Thomas asked. "It was crushed in the collapse. The gold and the rubies will be recovered from the rubble." Father John said with a smile, "We will use them to forge a new cross. But this time, it will not be a secret hidden away. It will stay in the square, for everyone to see. It will be a reminder that the truth always comes to light." Thomas looked at his hands. They were scarred and dirty from the night's work. He was no longer just the man who walked the walls at night. He had seen the depths of the town's secrets and helped bring it into the light. "And what about you, Thomas?" the priest asked. "The mayor wants to make you the new master of the guard." Thomas shook his head slowly. "I am a watchman, Father. I like the quiet of the night and the stars. I think I will stay exactly where I am, but I will keep a closer eye on the library from now on." As Thomas walked back toward his small house, he saw Mark sitting on a bench near the north gate. His head was bandaged, but he was laughing with a group of friends. He waved at Thomas, a look of deep respect in his eyes. The mystery of the Golden Cross was solved. Oakhaven was no longer a place of hidden lions and sharp teeth. It was a town of free people, guarded by a man who knew that even the smallest light can chase away the darkest shadow. The transition from winter to spring in Oakhaven was usually a time of quiet celebration. The ice on the river melted, and the first green buds appeared on the ancient oaks that gave the town its name. However, for Thomas, the peace felt fragile. Even though Brother Paul was gone and the lion had been tamed, a man who spent his life watching the shadows couldn't help but look for new ones. 3 months had passed since the night of the crumbling church. The new Golden Cross, forged from the remains of the old and donated jewels from the townspeople, stood proudly in the square. It was a symbol of their resilience. But as the sun began to set on a Tuesday evening, the sound of heavy hooves and the clatter of a fine carriage echoed through the north gate. This was no merchant wagon. The carriage was painted a deep, royal blue with gold filigree. 4 white horses, their coats shining even in the dim light, pulled the heavy vehicle. 2 riders in silver plate armor rode ahead, carrying banners with the king's crest, a golden hawk. Thomas stood by the gate, his spear held loosely. He watched as the carriage stopped in the center of the town square. A footman stepped down and opened the door. Out stepped a man who looked like he belonged in a palace, not a border town. He was tall and thin, wearing a velvet doublet of crimson and black. His hair was perfectly white, and his eyes were as sharp and cold as a winter morning. "I am Sir Alistair Thorne," the man announced, his voice carrying across the quiet square. "Envoy of His Majesty, King Edward IV. I am here to speak with the mayor regarding a discovery of legal importance." Lord Richard stepped out from the town hall, looking older than he had 3 months ago. He bowed politely, but Thomas noticed the way the mayor's hands gripped his own coat. "Welcome to Oakhaven, Sir Alistair. We were not expecting a royal visit." "The crown has a long memory, Lord Richard," Alistair replied, his gaze sweeping over the townspeople who had gathered to watch. "We heard rumors of a lost charter, a document of significant power. I have been sent to verify its authenticity and to ensure it is properly protected by the King's law." Thomas felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Protected was a word people of power used when they wanted to take something away. He watched Sir Alistair's movements carefully. The envoy wasn't looking at the people or the beautiful new cross. He was looking at the town hall, specifically the window where the charter was kept in a glass case. "The charter is safe here," Thomas said, stepping forward. He didn't bow. He remained standing, the watchman of the night. Sir Alistair turned his cold eyes on Thomas. "And who might you be?" "A simple guard with a dirty coat." "I am the man who found it," Thomas said calmly. Alistair smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, the hero of the hour. We shall see how much of a hero you are when the true weight of the law is felt. Lord Richard, we have much to discuss. To the study, if you please." As they walked away, Thomas noticed something strange. One of the silver-armored riders stayed behind. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the ground, tracing the path toward the great church with a methodical, predatory focus. The meeting in the mayor's study lasted long into the night. Thomas remained outside in the hallway, leaning against the cold stone wall. He could hear the muffled sounds of Alistair's sharp, demanding voice and the mayor's softer, more hesitant replies. Every so often, the word taxes or jurisdiction would drift through the heavy oak door. Late into the hour, the door opened. Sir Alistair walked out, followed by a pale Lord Richard. The envoy held a scroll in his hand, sealed with a massive crimson wax stamp, the king's personal signet. "It is settled then," Alistair said, not looking back. "The document remains under my supervision until the royal cartographers arrive to map the new boundaries. You are to ensure that no one, and I mean no one, disturbs the archives." He walked past Thomas without a word, the scent of expensive lavender and old parchment trailing behind him. Lord Richard sighed and slumped against the door frame. "What did he say, my lord?" Thomas asked. "He says the charter might be a forgery, Thomas," the mayor whispered. "He says the ink and the seal don't match the records in the capital. He wants to take it back to the City of Iron for testing." "You can't let him," Thomas said. "If that document leaves Oakhaven, it will never come back. The people will lose everything we fought for." "I know," Richard said, rubbing his eyes. "But he has the king's seal. To defy him is to defy the crown. He has given us 3 days to prepare the transit. He says the roads are dangerous, so he will take a company of soldiers with him." Thomas didn't like the sound of a company of soldiers. Oakhaven was a peaceful place now, and a sudden influx of royal troops would feel more like an occupation than an escort. Determined to find more information, Thomas waited until Sir Alistair had retired to the best room in the Silver Flagon. He moved through the shadows of the tavern's alleyway, climbing the trellis to the second floor. He didn't want to steal, he wanted to see. Peering through the window, He saw Alistair sitting at a small desk. The envoy was not sleeping. He was writing a letter, his pen moving with feverish speed. On the desk, next to the inkwell, lay a ring. It wasn't the hawk of the king. It was a different symbol, a crown that appeared to be broken in half, held together by a pair of silver hands. Thomas recognized the symbol from his time in the library. It belonged to the Order of the Broken Crown, a secret group of nobles who believed the king was too weak and that the old feudal laws, where lords owned the people like cattle, should be restored. This wasn't a royal mission. It was a coup. Alistair Thorne wasn't here to protect the charter. He was here to destroy the evidence of the people's freedom before the king ever found out it existed. Suddenly, Alistair stopped writing. He looked directly at the window. Thomas ducked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I know you are there, Watchman," Alistair called out, his voice smooth and cold. "You are quite good at hiding, but you forget one thing. A hawk always sees the mouse in the grass." Thomas did not stay to exchange words with Sir Alistair. He let go of the trellis and dropped into the dark alleyway. Landing. He knew the town guards, his friends, would not arrest him, but Alistair's silver-clad riders were a different matter. He needed distance and a place to think. He slipped through the shadows of the north gate, avoiding the main road where the royal sentries stood tall. He headed into the deep oaks, the thick forest that gave the town its name. The spring rain had turned the ground into a soft sponge, and the smell of wet moss was heavy in the air. Thomas knew these woods better than anyone. He had tracked deer and lost travelers here for years. About a mile into the forest, he saw the flicker of a campfire. It wasn't the large, organized camp of a royal battalion. It was small, hidden in a natural hollow shielded by a wall of stone. Thomas crept closer, his heart beating a steady rhythm against his ribs. He counted 10 men. They were not wearing the silver plate of the king's hawk. Instead, they wore mismatched leather armor and carried heavy, notched axes. These were mercenaries, sellswords who fought for gold, not honor. They were the company of soldiers Alistair had mentioned. "Sir Alistair says we move at dawn," one of the men grumbled, sharpening a blade. "He wants the parchment destroyed the moment we cross the valley bridge." "Why burn it?" another asked. "If it's gold he wants, why not hold the town for ransom?" "Because the parchment is the only thing stopping the lords from taking the land," a third voice answered, a woman's voice. Thomas shifted his weight, but a dry twig snapped under his boot. The mercenaries froze. "Who's there?" the leader barked, reaching for his axe. Before Thomas could run, a hand clamped firmly over his mouth from behind. A sharp blade pressed against his throat. He felt the cold steel and the heat of another person's breath. "Don't make a sound," a woman whispered in his ear. She dragged him back into the deeper shadows behind a massive oak. When she finally released him, Thomas turned to find a woman dressed in forest green and brown leather. She carried a longbow of yew and had a quiver of black feathered arrows on her back. Her face was painted with streaks of dark mud for camouflage. "You're the watchman," she said, her eyes scanning him. "I've been watching you since the carriage arrived." "Who are you?" Thomas asked, rubbing his neck. "My name is Ilara," she said. "I'm a ranger from the borderlands. I've been tracking Alistair Thorne for 3 weeks. He's not a king's envoy. He's a traitor who stole the king's seal after murdering the real messenger in the southern pass." Thomas felt a cold wave of realization. The danger to Oakhaven was far greater than a legal dispute. They were dealing with a murderer who had the power of a stolen crown. "We have to get back," Thomas said. "He's going to take the charter at dawn." "He already has it," Ilara replied grimly. "The carriage you saw in the square. It's a distraction. He's planning to leave through the old mountain path while the town watches the main road." The trek back to Oakhaven felt twice as long as the journey out. Thomas and Ilara moved with the silence of shadows, avoiding the mercenaries who had begun to scout the perimeter of their camp. As they reached the edge of the town, the first light of dawn was beginning to turn the sky a bruised purple. Thomas led Ilara through the secret drainage tunnel he had used once before. They emerged behind the great church. From their vantage point, they could see the town square. The royal blue carriage was already prepped. The horses were harnessed, and the silver-armored riders stood at attention. "Look," Ilara whispered, pointing toward the town hall. Sir Alistair stepped out, carrying a long wooden tube protected by iron bands. To any observer, it looked like the charter was being moved with great care. He placed the tube inside the carriage and locked the door with a heavy key. "Lord Richard," Alistair called out. The mayor stepped forward, looking tired and defeated. "We depart now. Do not follow. The king's business is private." The carriage began to move, its wheels clattering loudly on the stones. A crowd of townspeople watched in silence, their faces filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. They believed their freedom was rolling away on those four wheels. "Wait," Thomas said, squinting as the carriage passed a street lamp. "The carriage is sitting too high." "What do you mean?" Ilara asked. "I've spent my life watching wagons," Thomas explained. "A carriage carrying a heavy iron-bound tube, 2 guards, and a nobleman should sit lower on its springs. It's light. It's empty." Ilara nodded. "A decoy. He wants the town, and anyone following, to chase the blue carriage toward the south gate. But where is the real charter?" "The silver flagon," Thomas realized. The merchant, Master William, was supposed to leave this morning with his wagon of scraps. Alistair must have made a deal with him or threatened him. They ran through the back alleys, heading for the tavern. In the stable yard, they saw Master William's plain, mud-covered wagon. It looked like any other merchant's cart, filled with barrels of cheap ale and sacks of grain. But standing beside the wagon was the rider Thomas had noticed the day before, the one who had been studying the ground. The rider wasn't wearing his silver armor now. He wore a simple brown tunic, but he held a long, thin blade that looked far too expensive for a commoner. "Master William is already gone," Ilara whispered, spotting the empty stable. "The wagon is just pulling out." "Then who is that?" Thomas asked, looking at the man with the thin blade. The man turned his head. Even in the dim light, his eyes were unmistakable. He wasn't a soldier. He was an assassin. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small glass vial, pouring a thick, green liquid along the edge of his sword. "Alistair's shadow," Ilara said, her hand reaching for an arrow. "He's staying behind to make sure no one, especially a meddling watchman, is left alive to tell the king the truth." The assassin smiled, a cold, thin line on his face. He didn't look at Ilara. He looked straight at Thomas. He knew exactly who was the greatest threat to the plan. The assassin moved with a fluid, terrifying grace that Thomas had never seen in a common soldier. He didn't charge. He glided across the muddy stable yard, his poisoned blade humming through the air. Ilara reacted instantly, drawing her bow and letting an arrow fly in one smooth motion. The man didn't even look. He simply tilted his head, and the black-feathered shaft hissed past his ear, thudding into a wooden post. "Go!" Ilara shouted, reaching for another arrow. "The wagon is heading for the old mountain path. I'll handle this shadow." Thomas hesitated. He was a watchman, not a warrior, but he couldn't leave her alone with a professional killer. "Ilara, he's faster than he looks." "So am I," she snapped. She leaped onto a stack of hay bales, firing again. This time, the assassin had to deflect the arrow with his blade, the metal clashing with a spark that lit up the grey dawn. Thomas knew she was right. If Master William reached the mountain pass, the charter would be lost forever. He turned and ran toward the back gate of the stable yard, grabbing a horse that had been left saddled, a sturdy grey mare belonging to the tavern. He swung into the saddle, his spear balanced in his hand, and kicked the horse into a gallop. As he rode out of the yard, he looked back. The assassin had closed the distance, his thin sword flashing like a silver snake against Alara's bow. Thomas felt a pang of guilt, but he focused his eyes on the road ahead. The wagon tracks were deep in the soft mud, leading away from the main road and toward the steep, rocky ascent of the Vane Mountains. The air grew colder as the elevation rose. The path narrowed, with the cliff face on one side and a sheer drop into the mist-filled valley on the other. Thomas pushed the mare hard. He could hear the distant rumble of wagon wheels and the frantic whipping of horses. Suddenly, the wagon came into view. Master William was driving like a madman, his face twisted with terror. Beside him sat a man in a dark cloak, one of Alistair's mercenaries. They weren't just carrying the charter, they were carrying the death warrant of Oakhaven's freedom. "William! Stop!" Thomas yelled, the wind whipping his words away. The mercenary in the wagon turned and raised a crossbow. He didn't aim for Thomas, he aimed for the grey mare. The bolt whistled through the air, grazing the horse's flank. The mare screamed and reared up, her hooves skidding on the icy edge of the path. Thomas fought for control, the abyss yawning just inches beneath his stirrup. Thomas managed to steady the horse, but the wagon had gained precious ground. They were approaching the Bridge of Sighs, an ancient stone structure that crossed the roaring white water of the Blackwash River. It was the only way across the gorge. If they crossed it and destroyed the bridge behind them, Thomas would never catch them. He leaned low over the mare's neck. "Just a little more, girl," he whispered. The wagon reached the bridge first. The mercenary jumped off the back before it had even stopped. He began fumbling with a ceramic jar filled with black powder and a slow-burning fuse. They weren't just going to cross, they were going to blow the bridge to smithereens. Thomas didn't slow down. As he reached the foot of the bridge, he leveled his spear. The mercenary saw him coming and dropped the fuse to draw a short sword. Thomas used the momentum of the horse, the heavy ash wood of the spear striking the man's chest. The mercenary was thrown backward, tumbling over the low stone wall and disappearing into the spray of the waterfall below. Master William was still in the driver's seat, frozen with fear. "Thomas, I had no choice. They threatened my family. The charter, William. Give it to me." Thomas shouted, dismounting and running toward the back of the wagon. He threw aside the sacks of grain. Beneath them sat the iron-bound tube. He grabbed it, but as he turned, he saw a flicker of movement in the trees on the far side of the bridge. Sir Alistair Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the pines. He wasn't in a carriage, he was on a black stallion, and he held a heavy wheel-lock pistol, a rare and deadly weapon from the southern kingdoms. "You really are a persistent nuisance, Thomas," Alistair said, his voice calm despite the roaring water. "Give me the tube, or I will put a hole in Master William's head, and then yours." Thomas looked at William, then at the tube in his hands. He could feel the weight of thousands of lives within the iron bands. If he gave it up, the town would fall. If he didn't, people would die right here. "The king will hear of this," Thomas said, his voice trembling with rage. "The king only hears what I tell him," Alistair replied, cocking the hammer of the pistol. "And dead men tell no tales at all. Drop it. Now." Thomas looked down at the ceramic jar of black powder the mercenary had dropped. The fuse was still there, lying in a dry patch of dirt. A plan, desperate and mad, began to form in his mind. The wind howled through the gorge, carrying the spray of the Blackwash River. Thomas stood on the Bridge of Sighs, the iron-bound tube clutched in his left hand. To his right, the ceramic jar of black powder sat precariously near the edge. Sir Alistair Thorne sat atop his black stallion, the ornate wheel-lock pistol levelled at Thomas's heart. "The fuse, Thomas," Alistair said, his voice cutting through the roar of the water. "Kick that jar over the edge and hand over the tube." My patience is as thin as this mountain air." Thomas looked at Master William. The merchant was trembling, his eyes darting between the pistol and the dark water below. Thomas knew he couldn't outrun a bullet. He shifted his weight, making it look like he was preparing to comply. "I'm just a watchman, Alistair," Thomas said, his voice low. "I don't care for politics. But I know a thief when I see one." As he spoke, Thomas kicked his foot, not toward the jar, but toward a loose, jagged stone on the bridge's floor. At the same moment, he dropped the iron tube. As it hit the stone with a loud clang, Alistair flinched, his finger tightening on the trigger. The pistol fired, the lead ball whistling past Thomas's ear and shattering a stone pillar behind him. The bridge was suddenly filled with thick, acrid smoke. Using the momentary blindness, Thomas grabbed the fuse and struck it against the flint in his pocket. A spark caught. The fuse began to hiss and spit fire. "William, run!" Thomas shouted. The merchant didn't need to be told twice. He leaped from the wagon and scrambled back toward the Oakhaven side of the bridge. Thomas grabbed the iron tube from the ground and prepared to dive for cover. Alistair, realizing the pistol had missed, drew his heavy broadsword. He spurred his horse forward, the animal's hooves sparking on the bridge stones. "You fool! You'll kill us all." The fuse was inches from the jar. Thomas threw himself over the low stone wall of the bridge, catching a narrow ledge with his fingers. An instant later, the world turned into a deafening roar of orange and black. The bridge shuddered. Stones as large as houses were thrown into the air as the black powder ignited. The center of the bridge of size vanished. Thomas felt himself slipping, the cold air rushing past him as the ledge crumbled. Below, the Blackwash River waited like a hungry beast. Thomas didn't fall into the river. His heavy wool coat had caught on a protruding iron bracket, part of the bridge's ancient internal structure. He swung precariously over the abyss, the iron-bound tube still tucked under his arm. Above him, the smoke began to clear. The bridge was severed. On the Oakhaven side stood a terrified Master William. On the far side, Sir Alistair Thorne lay on the ground, his horse gone, his fine clothes torn and blackened. He was alive, but he was trapped on the wrong side of the gorge. "You've won nothing, Watchman!" Alistair screamed across the gap. "The Order of the Broken Crown is everywhere. That paper won't save you." Thomas ignored him. With a grunt of effort, he began to climb the iron brackets, his muscles screaming. He reached the broken edge of the bridge and rolled onto the stable stone. William ran to him, helping him up. "Thomas, you're alive!" The merchant cried. "We have to go. The mercenaries will be coming." "Wait," Thomas said, his eyes fixed on the iron tube. During the blast, the end cap had partially sheared off. A small, secondary parchment was visible, tucked inside the main charter. Thomas pulled it out. It wasn't a legal document. It was a personal letter, written in the same hand as the charter, but with a different seal, a secret seal known only to the inner circle of the old royal family. He read the words quickly. His breath caught in his throat. The charter wasn't just about land ownership. It was a confession. The old king had hidden a legitimate heir in Oakhaven, a child born of a secret marriage. The people's freedom was a shield to protect the bloodline from the very lords Alistair represented. "William," Thomas whispered, "the charter isn't just a document. It's a map to someone." "To who?" William asked, looking around nervously. Thomas looked back toward the town. He thought of the people he knew. He thought of the orphanage near the great church. He thought of the strange, silent boy who worked in the library, the one Brother Paul had taken in years ago. "The king's secret is still in Oakhaven," Thomas said. "And if Alistair knows about this second paper, he won't stop at the bridge. He'll burn the whole town to find that child." They heard the sound of horns in the distance. Mercenary signals. The hunt wasn't over. It had just changed targets. Thomas and Master William bypassed the main roads, taking the treacherous Goat's Path back toward Oakhaven. The rain had returned, a cold drizzle that turned the mountain dirt into a slick slurry. Thomas kept his hand firmly on the iron tube tucked inside his coat. The second parchment, the King's Confession, seemed to hum with a dangerous energy against his ribs. "We have to go to the library," Thomas whispered as they neared the town walls. Brother Paul didn't just take that boy in out of charity. He was a spider. William. He was keeping the fly in his web until he could sell it to the highest bidder. The boy's name was Leo. He was a quiet lad of 12 with hair the color of spun wheat and eyes a striking, piercing blue. Thomas remembered seeing him in the great church library, meticulously dusting the shelves or copying old texts. He had always seemed out of place among the dusty scrolls, too graceful, too observant. They entered Oakhaven through the drainage tunnel once more. The town was in a state of quiet panic. Word had spread that the charter was gone, and the royal envoy had vanished. Thomas headed straight for the library, leaving William to find Father John. Inside the library, the air was still thick with the smell of the previous night's smoke. Thomas found Leo in the back corner, near the genealogy section. The boy was holding a small, silver locket, staring at it with an expression of profound loneliness. "Leo," Thomas said softly. The boy jumped, hiding the locket behind his back. "Master Thomas, you're back," they said. They said the soldiers took the parchment. "The soldiers are gone, Leo," Thomas said, kneeling so he was at eye level with the boy. "But I need to see that locket. It's important." Leo hesitated, then slowly opened his hand. The locket was shaped like a phoenix, its wings folded around a small, brilliant ruby. Thomas recognized the craftsmanship. It was identical to the secret seal on the hidden letter. "My mother gave it to me," Leo whispered. "She told me never to show it to anyone. She said it was a burden of light. Your mother was protecting you, Leo," Thomas said, his heart heavy. "But the men who want to take that light away are coming. We have to get you to the south gate. There is a sanctuary in the valley where the king's loyalists are gathered." Am I someone else, Thomas?" Leo asked, his voice trembling. "You are the son of a king," Thomas said firmly. "And right now, you are the most important person in Oakhaven." Before they could move, the heavy library doors creaked open. It wasn't Father John. It was a man in a town guard's uniform. But his posture was wrong. He stood with the predatory stillness of a wolf. It was the Shadow, Alistair's assassin. He had survived the stable-yard and had found a new skin. "The boy," the Shadow said, his voice a dry rasp. "And the paper. Hand them over, Watchman, and I might leave you your tongue." Thomas didn't wait for the Shadow to move. He grabbed a heavy wooden stool and hurled it at the man, then scooped Leo up and ran for the spiral staircase that led to the library roof. "Stay close, Leo," Thomas shouted. They scrambled onto the leads of the roof. Below them, the town square was a blur of grey stone and mist. Thomas looked toward the south gate. He could see the silhouettes of guards standing on the walls, but he couldn't tell who was a friend and who was a mercenary in disguise. They climbed down the back scaffolding and sprinted through the narrow alleys of the Weavers' district. As they approached the south gate, Thomas saw Robert the blacksmith. The big man looked distressed, his hammer gripped tight in his hand. "Robert, thank the heavens," Thomas panted, reaching the gate. "We need to get the boy out. The Shadow is in the town." Robert looked at Leo, then at Thomas. His eyes were filled with a strange, dark conflict. "Thomas, I can't let you pass." Thomas froze. What are you talking about? Robert. This is Leo. You know him. They have my daughter, Thomas. Robert said, his voice breaking. The mercenaries. They found her at the farm. Sir Alistair sent word through a rider. If the boy stays, she lives. If he leaves, she dies. The sound of slow clapping echoed from the shadows of the gatehouse. The shadow stepped out, his thin blade already unsheathed. Beside him stood two other guards, their faces cold and unfamiliar. They had been bought or replaced. A father's love is a powerful lever. The shadow said, smiling, "Move aside. Blacksmith. Let the boy come to me." "Robert, don't do this," Thomas pleaded. "If they take him, Oakhaven is lost anyway. They won't keep their word." "I have to," Robert roared, raising his hammer. He didn't aim it at Thomas. He aimed it at the winch for the heavy portcullis. With one massive blow, he smashed the iron gears. The portcullis slammed down, sealing the south gate. They were trapped. The shadow moved like a blur. He didn't go for Thomas. He went for Leo. Thomas lunged forward, using his spear to block the assassin's strike. The metal clashed, the vibration humming up Thomas's arms. "Run, Leo! Back to the church!" Thomas yelled. But the shadow was too fast. He kicked Thomas in the chest, sending him sprawling against the stone wall. He reached for Leo's collar, his poisoned blade glinting in the pale morning light. Just as the blade was about to fall, an arrow whistled through the air, piercing the shadow's shoulder. Ilara dropped from the wall, her longbow already notched with another shaft. "I told you I'd handle him, Watchman." The shadow hissed in pain, clutching his shoulder. He looked at the portcullis, then at the growing crowd of townspeople who were beginning to realize something was wrong. "This isn't over." The shadow snarled, disappearing back into the maze of the gatehouse. Thomas stood up, leaning on his spear. The gate was closed, the shadow was loose, and the town was turning into a prison. The sound of the falling portcullis had acted as a signal. From the rooftops and the narrow side streets, men in the grey cloaks of the Broken Crown began to emerge. They weren't just mercenaries. They were professional soldiers, veterans of the Southern Wars. Within minutes, the central square of Oakhaven was surrounded. The townspeople, caught between their homes and the market stalls, were herded toward the center like frightened sheep. Thomas, Ilara, and Leo retreated toward the stone fountain in the middle of the square. Robert the blacksmith stood nearby, his head bowed in shame, his massive hammer resting on the cobbles. He had sealed the gate, but he had not joined the enemy. "They're not attacking," Ilara whispered, her eyes scanning the rooftops. "They're waiting. They want us trapped in the open." Suddenly, the crowd parted. Sir Alistair Thorne walked into the square. He looked battered and singed from the bridge explosion, his fine silk doublet torn and stained with soot, but his eyes burned with a cold, triumphant light. He was no longer pretending to be a royal envoy. He held a heavy crossbow, and behind him, a dozen men-at-arms formed a semicircle of steel. "The boy, Thomas," Alistair said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Give me the boy and the second parchment. If you do, I will leave this wretched town and its people in peace." "You already promised that to Robert," Thomas shouted back, his hand on Leo's shoulder. "And you used his daughter to do it. You don't know the meaning of peace." Alistair's face darkened. "I know the meaning of order. A kingdom cannot survive on the whims of peasants and hidden bastards. The Broken Crown will restore the natural hierarchy. Now, hand him over, or I will let my men sharpen their blades on your neighbors." Thomas looked around. The townspeople were terrified, but as they looked at Leo, the quiet boy who had grown up among them, their fear began to turn into a low, rumbling anger. They had found their freedom in the charter, and they weren't ready to let it go. "We stand with the watchman," a voice cried out. It was Master William, the merchant. He had gathered a group of men from the tavern, armed with nothing more than heavy clubs and kitchen knives. "The boy is one of ours," Mistress Elena added, stepping forward from her weaving shop. Alistair sneered. "So be it. Archers, aim for the fountain." The men on the rooftops raised their bows. Thomas pulled Leo down behind the thick stone basin of the fountain. The air was suddenly filled with the whistle of arrows, the shafts thudding into the wood of market stalls and the stone of the fountain. The siege of Oakhaven had begun in earnest, and the blood of its people was about to water the stones of their own square. The first volley of arrows had scattered the crowd, sending people diving into doorways and behind carts. The square was a chaos of screaming and the clash of steel. Thomas huddled behind the fountain, his mind racing. He had his spear, and Ilara had her bow, but they were outnumbered 5-1. Robert the blacksmith still stood near the gatehouse, paralyzed. His daughter was a prisoner, and his town was burning. He looked at the mangled gears of the portcullis he had destroyed, then at the shadow, who had reappeared on a balcony overlooking the square. The assassin was pointing toward the fountain, directing a group of mercenaries to charge. "Robert!" Thomas yelled over the din. "Help us! If they take the square, no one is safe, not even your daughter." Robert looked up. His eyes met Thomas's, and then they drifted to Leo. The boy looked remarkably calm, his small hand gripping the silver phoenix locket. In that moment, the blacksmith saw not a royal secret, but a child who needed protection. With a roar that sounded more like a wounded bear than a man, Robert picked up his hammer. He didn't run toward the mercenaries. Instead, he turned toward the stone wall of the gatehouse, the section that housed the internal counterweights for the portcullis. "Alistair!" Robert screamed. "You lied to me. You never had her. I saw your men leading the horses toward the north gate. She's not in the valley. She's in the wagon." Robert swung the hammer with all his might. The stone wall cracked under the force of the blow. He swung again, and the masonry shattered, revealing the massive lead weights that held the gate down. With a final, desperate strike, he smashed the holding pin. The mechanism didn't just break, it exploded. The lead weights dropped like stones, and the portcullis, the very gate that had trapped them, began to groan and rise as the tension was released. "The gate is open!" The townspeople shouted. But Alistair wasn't watching the gate. He was watching Robert. "Kill him!" The envoy barked. The shadow leaped from the balcony, his poisoned blade aimed for the blacksmith's throat. But Robert was ready. He swung the hammer in a wide arc, the heavy iron head catching the assassin mid-air. The shadow was sent flying across the square, crashing through the front window of the apothecary. "Thomas! Take the boy out!" Robert shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'll hold them here." Thomas grabbed Leo's hand and looked at Ilara. "We have to go. The south gate leads to the royal road. If we can reach the king's outposts, we can bring back a Real army." They ran for the rising gate. Behind them, Robert stood like a titan, his hammer a blur of silver as he held the line against Alistair's men. He was choosing his town over his own safety, and in doing so, he was giving the king's secret a fighting chance. The south gate groaned as the portcullis rose just high enough for Thomas, Leo, and Ilara to slide through. Behind them, the sounds of the square were a cacophony of clashing metal and Robert's defiant roars. Thomas didn't look back. He knew that any hesitation would cost them the narrow window of escape the blacksmith had bought with his life. "To the stables by the wall," Ilara commanded, her voice sharp and focused. They reached a small, secondary stable used by the gate guards. 2 horses remained, a sturdy chestnut and a lean, black hunter. Thomas hoisted Leo onto the chestnut, climbing up behind him, while Ilara vaulted onto the hunter. They didn't take the main road. Ilara led them down a steep, narrow path that hugged the outer curtain wall, hidden from the view of the archers on the battlements by a thick growth of ivy and ancient brambles. As they cleared the final ridge, Thomas looked back at Oakhaven. Smoke was rising from the weavers' district, and the great church stood like a silent sentinel over the chaos. He felt the iron tube and the secret letter pressing against his chest. "We need to reach the crest of the Falcon," Ilara said, pointing toward a distant, jagged peak to the west. "There's a hidden signal pyre there. If we light it, the king's border rangers will know the provincial peace has been broken." Leo gripped the horse's maner, his knuckles white. "Will the town be okay, Master Thomas?" "The people of Oakhaven are stronger than Alistair knows, Leo," Thomas said, though his heart was heavy. "But right now, the best way to help them is to make sure you stay out of his hands." They galloped into the tree line of the Forest of Whispers, a place where the trees grew so close together that the sun barely touched the forest floor. It was a labyrinth of silver birch and ancient pine, a place where sound traveled in strange ways and paths seemed to shift in the mist. "Stay close," Ilara warned. "Alistair's light cavalry will be behind us soon, and they have hounds." As if on cue, a long, mournful howl echoed through the trees behind them. It wasn't the sound of a wild wolf. It was the deep, resonant baying of a bloodhound, a royal tracker. Alistair had released the dogs. The deeper they rode into the Forest of Whispers, the more the air seemed to thicken with a heavy, damp fog. The horses' hooves were muffled by a carpet of deep moss, making their flight eerily silent. Thomas kept his spear leveled, his eyes darting between the pale trunks of the birch trees. Every shadow looked like a man-at-arms, every rustle of leaves sounded like a drawn sword. "The hounds are gaining," Ilara whispered, pulling her horse to a halt at a fork in the path. She dismounted and knelt, pressing her ear to the ground. 2 riders, 4 dogs. They've split from the main group to move faster. We can't outrun them in this mist, Thomas said, looking at Leo. The boy was shivering, his silver locket clutched tight. "We have to lose the scent." Thomas looked at a narrow stream cutting through the ravine to their left. "Ilara, take Leo and ride through the water for a mile. I'll stay here and give the hounds something else to follow." "Thomas, no," Leo protested, his blue eyes wide. "I'm the watchman, Leo. It's my job to stay behind while others go to safety," Thomas said with a tired smile. He handed the iron tube to Ilara. "Keep the charter safe. If I don't make it to the signal pyre, find Father John's contact in the capital." Ilara nodded solemnly, recognizing the look in Thomas's eyes. She grabbed Leo's reins. "Don't die, watchman. I still haven't shown you how to properly fletch an arrow." They disappeared into the stream, the splashing of water quickly fading into the fog. Thomas turned his horse and rode in the opposite direction, intentionally snapping low-hanging branches and scraping his boots against the bark of the trees. He pulled a small pouch of dried meat from his stall bag. The salt and fat would leave a trail no hound could ignore. He reached a clearing where an ancient, hollowed-out oak stood. He dismounted and led the chestnut into the hollow, then climbed the tree himself, perching on a thick limb hidden by the dense canopy. Minutes later, the hounds arrived. They were massive, ugly beasts with sagging jowls and eyes full of a singular purpose. Behind them rode 2 of Alistair's mercenaries, their silver and crimson surcoats splattered with mud. "The scent is hot here," one shouted, struggling to hold the leashes as the dogs circled the hollow oak. Thomas held his breath, his hand gripping the cold iron of his spear. He wasn't just hiding, he was waiting. He needed to take these riders out if Leo was to have any chance. As the lead mercenary dismounted to inspect the hollow tree, Thomas prepared to drop. He was the watchman of Oakhaven, and in this forest, The shadows belonged to him. The mercenary stepped into the hollow of the ancient oak, his sword drawn. He expected to find a frightened watchman and a royal boy cowering in the dark. Instead, he found only an empty saddle and the lingering scent of salt-cured meat. "It's a trick!" the mercenary yelled, but his warning came too late. Thomas dropped from the overhead limb like a falling shadow. He didn't use his spear yet. The close quarters of the clearing required speed. He landed squarely on the dismounted man's shoulders, the force of the impact driving the mercenary into the soft mud. Before the second rider could level his crossbow, Thomas rolled to his feet and snatched his spear from where it leaned against the trunk. The second rider fired. The bolt hissed through the air, grazing Thomas's shoulder, but the watchman didn't flinch. He lunged forward, the ashwood shaft of his spear catching the mercenary in the throat before he could reload. The man fell from his horse, the hounds barking in a frenzied circle around their fallen masters. Thomas stood in the center of the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The hounds were confused, their leashes tangled in the undergrowth. He didn't kill the beasts. He simply cut their tethers and shooed them into the deep forest. Without their riders, they were just hungry dogs, no longer a threat to a trail they couldn't find. He didn't stay to celebrate. He knew more riders would be following the sound of the hounds. He whistled for the chestnut horse, swung into the saddle, and turned back toward the stream. His shoulder burned where the bolt had bit into his flesh, but he pushed the pain aside. He had a signal to light. By the time he reached the base of the crest of the Falcon, the mist had begun to thin, revealed a moonlit world of jagged stone and silver frost. He could see two silhouettes high above, moving steadily toward the summit. "Ilara and Leo. Wait for me," Thomas whispered, urging the horse up the steep, rocky incline. He wasn't just a watchman anymore. He was the protector of a kingdom's future, and he wouldn't let the fire go out. The climb to the summit was a test of pure endurance. The path was little more than a series of narrow ledges and crumbling shale. Thomas had to abandon his horse halfway up, the animal unable to find footing on the sheer rock. He climbed the final 100 feet on foot, his fingers raw and bleeding as he pulled himself over the final ridge. He found Ilara and Leo standing before the signal pyre. It was a massive structure of seasoned pine and birch, built decades ago but kept dry under a heavy leather top. "Thomas!" Leo ran to him, throwing his arms around the watchman's waist. "We thought the riders got you." Takes more than 2 mercenaries to stop an Oakhaven watchman. Thomas panted, leaning on his spear. He looked at Ilara. "Is it ready?" "The oil is poured," she said, holding a piece of flint and a striker. "But once we light this, Alistair will know exactly where we are. We'll be trapped on this peak until help arrives, if it arrives at all. The King's Rangers don't ignore the Falcon's light," Thomas said firmly. "Light it." Ilara struck the flint. A spark showered onto the oil-soaked kindling. For a moment, there was only a small, flickering orange glow. Then, the flames roared upward, a pillar of brilliant white and orange fire that sliced through the darkness of the mountain range. The heat was intense, forcing them back toward the edge of the cliff. From the valley below, Thomas heard a distant, faint sound, the blowing of a war horn. It wasn't the high, clear note of the Rangers. It was the deep, discordant blast of Alistair's main force. They were at the base of the mountain, and they were coming up. "He's not going to wait for the king," Ilara said, her hand reaching for her final quiver of arrows. "He's going to try to kill us before the first ranger reaches the ridge." Thomas looked at the narrow path they had just climbed. It was the only way up. He stood at the head of the trail, his spear leveled, his silhouette cast in giant, dancing shadows by the roaring beacon behind him. "Leo, stay behind the pyre," Thomas ordered. "Ilara, save your arrows for the officers. I'll hold the ledge." The first of the mercenaries appeared in the firelight, their swords glinting. Behind them, Sir Alistair Thorne climbed slowly, his face twisted in a mask of ultimate rage. He didn't care about the charter anymore. He wanted the boy's blood on the stone. The final battle for Oakhaven wasn't happening in the square. It was happening here, in the clouds, at the very edge of the world. The narrow ledge at the summit of the crest of the Falcon became a bottleneck of blood and iron. The roaring heat of the signal pyre turned the freezing mountain air into a shimmering haze. Thomas stood his ground, his spear darting like an adder, keeping the first 3 mercenaries at bay. Behind him, Ilara's bow sang a rhythmic, deadly tune, her black feathered arrows finding the gaps in the attacker's leather armor. Out of the way, peasant! Sir Alistair Thorne screamed from the rear, pushing his own men aside. He drew a heavy, curved saber that glowed orange in the firelight. You are protecting a ghost. The broken crown will rule, with or without this boy. Thomas lunged, but his fatigue was showing. His spear point grazed Alistair's shoulder, but the nobleman parried the shaft with a brutal strike, splintering the wood. Thomas was left with only the jagged remains of the handle. Alistair laughed, raising his saber for the killing blow. Leo cried out, clutching his silver locket as if it could shield them. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the night, a thunderous, rhythmic drumming that wasn't the beating of hearts or the crackle of fire. It was the sound of dozens of iron-shod hooves striking the rocky slope from the western trail. A volley of arrows, far more precise and numerous than Ilara's, rained down from the higher ridges. The mercenaries at the back of Alistair's line fell instantly. From the darkness emerged the king's border rangers, led by a commander in gleaming silver and green plate armor. By order of King Edward IV. The commander bellowed, "Drop your weapons or face the High Executioner." Alistair froze, his saber inches from Thomas's throat. He looked at the burning beacon, then at the forest of spears now surrounding the summit. He had been caught in the act of high treason by the very men he claimed to represent. With a cry of frustrated rage, Alistair turned to flee toward the cliff edge. But Thomas, using his last bit of strength, tripped the nobleman with a broken spear handle. Alistair tumbled into the snow, disarmed and defeated. The aftermath was a blur of activity. The rangers secured the prisoners, while their healers tended to Thomas's shoulder and Ilara's exhaustion. The commander knelt before Leo, recognizing the phoenix locket and the unmistakable blue eyes of the royal line. "The king has been searching for you, Young Highness," the commander said softly. "Oakhaven has kept its secret well." Weeks later, a new dawn rose over Oakhaven. The town was rebuilding. The charter was back in its glass case, but its secret was now protected by a royal garrison. Robert the blacksmith had survived his wounds and was hailed as a hero. Leo had been taken to the capital to be raised in the safety of the palace, though he promised to return one day. Lord Richard offered Thomas a chest of gold and a title of nobility for his service. Thomas, standing at his usual post by the north gate, politely declined. "What I wanted was the safety of my home, my lord," Thomas said, looking at the peaceful streets. "A watchman's reward is a night where nothing happens. I have that now." As the sun set, Thomas lit his lantern. The shadows were just shadows again, and the lion was a legend told to children. He began his walk, a steady light in a town that was finally, truly free.